Before he was that king, the one who talked to trees and had 18th century doctors sticking hot irons to his feet like it was medicine, George III was actually kind of a royal catch. He wasn't wild, scandalous, or even particularly fun, really, but he was exactly what Britain thought it needed at the time. Stable, serious, and shockingly domestic. Think of him as the monarchy's golden retriever, earnest, well-groomed, and just happy to be here. Hello, travelers. Histories do not always need to be boring. You can rest here and listen to hilarious histories to drift off to sleep. Tonight, we will explore the topic, why King George III had conversations with trees and many more. Before we continue, leave a comment to let me know when and where you are listening to this, and hit the subscribe button, but only if you enjoy what I do here. Let's begin. Let's start with something revolutionary. He was British, born in London in 1738. George III was the first monarch of the House of Hanover to be born and raised in the country he was supposed to rule. Unlike his grandfather, George I, who never even bothered to learn English, because who needs vowels when you've got power, and his father, Frederick, Prince of Wales, who had more beef with his dad than an entire Shakespeare play, George III was thoroughly, unambiguously English. He spoke the language, loved the land, and even liked the weather. Tolerated the weather. He was also one of the rare monarchs who didn't look at education like it was a mild disease. Young George devoured books like they were going out of print, which, to be fair, was always a risk in the 1700s. His tutors included the best minds of the Enlightenment, and while other royals were perfecting the art of scandal and syphilis, George was learning Latin, astronomy, agriculture, and philosophy. And then there was the farming. Oh, the farming. George didn't just dabble in agriculture, he was obsessed with it. He once said he gloried in the name of Britain. But let's be honest, he probably gloried more in the name of turnip cultivator extraordinaire. He spent hours studying crop rotation, livestock breeding, and the latest ploughing techniques. While other kings were busy conquering Europe or marrying their cousins, George was checking on his sheep, not metaphorically, literally. The man would leave state meetings to go inspect his fields. Imagine your boss stepping out of a UN summit because the zucchinis are flowering. That was George. His royal estate at Kew became a kind of Enlightenment-era experimental farm. He kept meticulous records on everything from barley yields to cow temperament. Honestly, had he not been king, he would have crushed it on historical TikTok as @GeorgieGrowsVeg. And as weirdly quaint as it sounds today, the British public adored him for it. After years of German-accented monarchs who barely set foot in England, and when they did, seemed vaguely annoyed by it, George was refreshingly, almost alarmingly, grounded. He married once to Queen Charlotte, who he actually liked, and had a truckload of children, 15. That's not an exaggeration. The couple was basically a royal version of a minivan. In an age where royalty was often one champagne flute away from bankruptcy and scandal, George was a teetotaling homebody. He didn't gamble, didn't take mistresses, and didn't set Versailles on fire. In fact, he refused to attend horse races because he thought it sent the wrong message. I mean, this guy was so squeaky clean that cartoons couldn't even find anything juicy to mock, so they started teasing him for being too into wheat. That's not a joke. The press nicknamed him Farmer George, which was meant as an insult, but George kind of loved it. While critics rolled their eyes, the public leaned in. Here was a king who seemed honest, reliable, and unlikely to throw a masquerade ball that ended in a duel. After all, if the monarch is personally checking on your potatoes, how bad can life really be? Even foreign visitors were surprised. One French diplomat, clearly baffled by the lack of royal theatrics, described George as a prince without vice. That's probably the most passive-aggressive thing a French noble could say. It was like they expected powdered wigs and powdered scandals, and instead got a man measuring milk yields and lecturing his sons about modesty. And yes, he had opinions. George took his role seriously. He believed in constitutional monarchy, but also that the king should have a real voice, not just a decorative crown and a parade budget. He was no puppet, and he had the backbone to prove it. Whether this was admirable leadership or stubborn micromanagement would become painfully clear later. But at this stage, it just looked like good, wholesome kinging. But here's the twist. All this normalcy, the clean living, the moral standards, the sheer anti-scandalousness of it all, it made what came next even more shocking. When things started to crack, and oh boy they cracked. It wasn't just the monarchy that looked unstable. It was the one guy everyone thought would never lose it. Because when the model monarch starts arguing with the shrubbery, even the begonias get nervous. Young George wasn't your typical monarch. He didn't gamble, didn't party, and probably thought YOLO meant yeoman order lax oats. Being king of Britain in the 1700s was kind of like being the CEO of a multinational company run entirely by handwritten notes, boats that moved at the speed of seaweed, and governors with god complexes. George III inherited an empire that stretched across oceans, cultures, time zones, and patience. And while the official maps showed neat pink patches covering the world, what they didn't show was how utterly bonkers it was to actually govern all of it. Let's start with the sheer scope of the thing. By the time George took the throne in 1760, Britain owned, meddled in, or planned to meddle in everything from sugar plantations in the Caribbean, to tea merchants in India, to fur traders in Canada, to colonists in North America, who, spoiler alert, were about to get real spicy about taxes. You couldn't swing a tricorn hat without hitting a region with a Union Jack on it. And sure, it looked impressive, like the Empire version of a guy with a six-pack and zero sleep. But running it, that was another story. Every single decision had to travel by boat. A boat that could be hijacked, lost in a storm, eaten by barnacles, or just show up 6 months late because someone fell asleep at the mast. If George wanted to issue an order to India, he had to write it, seal it, send it on a ship that took 4 to 6 months to get there, wait for them to open it, argue about it, write back, and send a reply which, guess what, took another 6 months. Best case scenario, you got a yes, we've received your message a year later. Worst case, it's intercepted, and suddenly France is doing whatever you asked first. George ran an empire so large, if he sent a letter to India, by the time it got there the weather had probably already changed. And speaking of governments, let's talk about colonial administration. Each region of the empire had its own little ecosystem of governors, viceroys, generals, merchants, smugglers, and absolutely everything is fine letters that almost always meant the opposite. George's ministers might say, all is well in Jamaica, while Jamaica is mid-revolt and half the island's sugar crop is on fire. The problem? George took all of this extremely personally. He wasn't a hands-off monarch. He didn't shrug and say, leave it to the colonies, they'll figure it out. No, George was a micromanager, a spreadsheet guy born before spreadsheets. He wanted to know what was going on everywhere, at all times, with everyone. And that's when the eye-twitching probably started. Take his obsession with military promotions. He once got involved in personally approving officer appointments in distant provinces. Imagine being in charge of a troop in Nova Scotia and having to wait 6 months for a man who's never seen snow to tell you whether you can hire a second in command. George wasn't a dictator, but he was a firm believer in royal oversight, and his royal eyes were everywhere. And it wasn't just logistics. The cultures within his empire were wildly different, often violently so. You had Puritan colonists in Massachusetts who thought dancing was sin, British elites in the West Indies who thought sugar plantations were a great idea for them, and East India Company agents in Bengal who were basically stockbrokers with cannons. Trying to create a consistent, harmonious empire out of that was like trying to make a salad out of raw meat, honey, and fireworks. The irony, while all this was going on, George himself almost never left England. The man who ruled global trade routes, governed tropical colonies, and had a crown polished with South African diamonds, he never stepped foot outside of Britain. His view of the empire came through reports, letters, maps, and men with powdered wigs who probably hadn't been outside London since the War of Jenkins' Ear, which made everything more stressful, because if something went wrong, George felt it as a personal failure. He wasn't just a king, he was the steward of Britain's destiny. Every rebellious outpost, every delayed fleet, every petition from a colony asking for basic rights, please, landed on his already overburdened desk. And then there were the finances. Oh boy, the finances. Maintaining a global empire doesn't come cheap. Armies had to be paid, navies needed ships, governors needed gifts, and of course the British taxpayer wasn't thrilled about footing the bill, especially for colonies that seemed to be constantly rioting or spilling tea in inappropriate places. So what do? You raise taxes. Overseas first, naturally, because it's easier to make people angry from a distance. But that plan would backfire spectacularly, because as it turns out, nobody likes being taxed by a guy who lives 3,000 miles away and keeps asking if your rice yields are up to par. George III's dream of empire wasn't just power, it was responsibility. He wanted to be a good king, the kind who knows what's happening in Granada and Gloucestershire. But the truth is, no one could control the empire he inherited. Not with ink, not with intention, and certainly not with a postal service that moved slower than continental drift. By the time the 1760s rolled around, George's brain was a messy corkboard of pins, strings and colonies, all labelled needs attention. And that, dear listener, is where things started unravelling. By the 1760s, King George III probably thought things were going okay. Sure, the empire was big, messy, and the colonial post was basically a game of guess what I said 6 months ago. But hey, he had a firm grip, a good heart, and plenty of ink in his quill. Unfortunately, 3,000 miles across the Atlantic, a different mood was brewing. And no, it wasn't just bad tea. It was a rising tide of frustration, taxation complaints, and revolutionary sass. Let's be clear. The American colonies hadn't always been so grumpy. For most of the 1600s and early 1700s, they were like that quiet cousin at family reunions. You know, polite, self-sufficient, and mostly happy to do their own thing. Britain, busy juggling wars, expansion, and the occasional continental panic, generally left them alone under a policy historians lovingly call salutary neglect. Translation: we're too busy to micromanage you, so just don't burn anything important. But that all changed after the 7 Years' War, aka the French and Indian War in North America. Britain won, hooray! Except, now they were deeply in debt, and their global empire had even more land to govern, fortify, and feed. Enter Parliament, stroking its collective chin and asking, what if we made the colonies help pay for all this? And thus the stage was set for one of the most iconic historical arguments in modern times. We tax you versus do you even know who we are? First came the Sugar Act, 1764. Colonists annoyed. Then the Stamp Act, 1765. Colonists furious. These acts weren't just about paying extra for paper or molasses. They were about principle. The colonists argued they shouldn't be taxed by a parliament in which they had no representation. Britain's response? But we virtually represent you, which is like being told your vote counts in a meeting you weren't invited to. George III, from his desk in London, wasn't exactly the evil mastermind people later imagined. He wasn't waking up each morning plotting ways to ruin Boston's mood, but he was absolutely convinced that Parliament had every right to tax its colonies. Why? Because, in his mind, they were British. And being British came with duties like paying taxes to the Crown and occasionally smiling while doing it. I will never consent to the absurd idea of giving up the colonies, George once said, basically summing up his entire vibe as, you can leave, but I will still consider you mine. What George didn't grasp was that these weren't just outposts anymore. The American colonies had evolved. They had their own governments, their own economies, their own sense of identity. Telling them they were still just extensions of the homeland was like telling your adult child living across the country that their house is technically still part of your property. Good luck with that. Then came the moment that turned snark into spectacle. The Boston Tea Party, 1773. Britain had just passed the Tea Act, which was meant to help the struggling East India Company by allowing it to sell tea directly to the colonies at a discount. The catch? It still came with a tax. To Britain, this looked like a bargain. To the colonists, it looked like a trap wrapped in a teacup. On December 16, 1773, a group of colonists dressed as Mohawk warriors because subtlety is for quitters, stormed Boston Harbor and chucked 342 chests of tea into the water. That's over 90,000 pounds of tea, enough to keep a nation of insomniacs jittery for months. When your pen pals start dumping tea into harbors, it's not a phase, it's a revolution. King George's reaction? Furious. He saw the act not as a prank or protest, but as open rebellion. This was no longer a tax dispute. This was treason, plain and simple. And treason in the royal rulebook came with serious consequences. The trouble was, everyone involved thought they were being the reasonable one. The colonists thought they were standing up for rights and fairness. George and Parliament thought they were defending the sanctity of law and order. No one blinked. No one backed down. Instead, Britain passed the Coercive Acts, aka the Intolerable Acts in America, which basically said, "Oh, you like dumping tea? Try functioning without your port or local government." In today's terms, it was like responding to a bad Yelp review by setting the customer's driveway on fire. At this point, George III was fully committed to the imperial high ground. He wasn't about to cave to what he saw as petulant colonists throwing a tantrum. Parliament was behind him, most of Britain was behind him. But the colonies, they were done. The idea of compromise fizzled faster than tea bags in salt water, and George's position hardened. He insisted, "The die is now cast. The colonies must either submit or triumph." Spoiler, they chose triumph. By the mid-1770s, the tea had been tossed, the tempers had boiled over, and the king's once loyal subjects across the Atlantic were about to declare something a little spicier than independence. And George, still clutching his quill, still believing this was a temporary mess. Unfortunately for him, the colonies were no longer pen pals. They were packing muskets. King George III was not, by any stretch of the imagination, a man who took rejection well. When the American colonies began their slow fade into independence, George didn't react with understanding or quiet dignity. No, he reacted like someone who's been left on red after sending an entire novella of emotional texts. From his perspective, the whole thing felt less like a revolution and more like a dramatic overreaction by a bunch of ungrateful pen pals who simply didn't appreciate how hard he'd been trying. At first, George didn't even believe the rebellion was real. He thought it was just a little colonial turbulence, something that could be solved with a strongly worded letter and possibly a few strategically placed redcoats. Rebellions, after all, were supposed to be loud but short-lived like thunder or opera singers. In his mind, the colonists would have a tantrum, calm down and return to their regularly scheduled tea-drinking, tax-paying existence. What he failed to notice was that this wasn't tantrum territory anymore. This was full-blown adolescence, complete with muskets, manifestos, and a developing taste for liberty. When the actual fighting began in 1775 at Lexington and Concord, George still refused to believe this was anything more than a regional kerfuffle. He issued a proclamation declaring the colonies in a state of rebellion, which was royal speak for everyone calm down and go back to work. It was a bit like responding to someone setting your car on fire by saying, "You seem upset, let's circle back to this after lunch." His refusal to acknowledge the scale of the conflict wasn't just hopeful, it was borderline delusional. And it didn't help that many of his advisors agreed with him, feeding him a steady diet of optimism and this'll-blow-over assurances. Then came the real breakup letter, the Declaration of Independence. It was written with all the decorum of a polite dinner invitation and all the underlying venom of a roast battle. The Americans opened with a flowery explanation about why they felt it necessary to separate, then proceeded to air a list of 27 grievances, almost all of which pointed directly at King George III as the root cause of their misery. If the declaration had a subtitle, it might have been something like, "It's not me, it's definitely you." To George, this was not only insulting, it was incomprehensible. He was being publicly dumped by people he still considered British. Worse, they weren't just leaving quietly, they were writing open letters to the entire world explaining why he sucked. The declaration painted him as a tyrant, a despot, And most devastating of all, a monarch who'd completely lost the plot. Jefferson and company didn't just want freedom, they wanted everyone to know how utterly done they were with George's leadership. And yet the king persisted. He continued to believe, even well into the war, that reconciliation was possible. His speeches to Parliament maintained the tone of a man who thought this was just a phase, that the colonies would wake up, realize they'd made a mistake and come home. He saw the rebellion as a misunderstanding, not a movement. While the Americans were forming a congress, raising armies and shopping around for French allies, George was still talking about restoring peace and bringing the colonies back into the fold, as if they'd just wandered off like sheep in need of a gentle shepherd, not like revolutionaries storming towards independence with bayonets and inspiration. But here's the kicker. George genuinely believed he was doing the right thing. He wasn't trying to crush liberty for fun. He truly thought the rebellion endangered the empire, the law, and even the future of civilization. In his mind, the colonists weren't heroes. They were anarchists tearing apart the great British order. He saw himself as the steady hand, the guiding star, the man holding the empire together while the Americans threw their furniture into the fire. Unfortunately, the more he dug in, the worse things got. The war dragged on. The British military strategy floundered. The Americans proved surprisingly good at not losing, which, in revolutionary warfare, is basically winning. France joined in. Spain got nosy. And George? He kept insisting this was just a temporary setback, like someone refusing to take the hint after the third unanswered text. He couldn't quite believe this breakup was permanent. He even blamed others for not being firm enough. When generals failed, he fumed. When Parliament hesitated, he sighed. But he never truly considered that maybe, just maybe, the colonies had outgrown him, that maybe they didn't want reconciliation. Maybe they wanted their own room, their own rules, and the right to throw their own tea parties without asking for permission first. George treated the revolution like a bad Tinder date, ignored all the red flags and still wondered why it ended. To him, the colonies weren't equals, making an informed decision. They were rebellious children slamming the door on their way out of the house. And in the aftermath, he didn't adjust his course or reflect. He simply doubled down, convinced that with time, firmness, and enough soldiers in funny hats, the colonies would come crawling back. Spoiler alert, they didn't. Losing 13 colonies is one thing. Losing your composure, your public favor, and arguably your marbles, well, that's a bit more dramatic. After the Declaration of Independence and the slow, painful unraveling of Britain's American hold, King George III didn't just take the loss on the chin. No, he took it on the soul, like a man whose prized antique tea set had been hurled into the harbor by rebellious dinner guests, and now he had to keep hosting the dinner party. For George, the post-revolution period wasn't just bruising, it was personally devastating. This was not a man who ruled from emotional detachment. George had staked his pride and moral duty on keeping the empire united. So when America packed its powdered wigs and stormed out, George was left clutching the crown and wondering how things had gone so wrong. The British people, once cheerleaders of their farmer king, were now side-eyeing him like he'd backed the wrong horse in a very expensive derby. Parliament wasn't much more supportive. Divisions sharpened, with Whigs and Tories squabbling over how exactly they'd managed to misplace an entire continent. And at the centre of it all was George, looking increasingly like the monarch equivalent of someone insisting his breakup was mutual while sobbing into a monogrammed hanky. To the public, the king started to seem off. He would walk the halls of Windsor Castle muttering to himself, talking to inanimate objects, and reportedly engaging in deep conversations with invisible participants, none of whom could offer better advice than the ministers already failing him. His legendary diligence once his strength became a source of strain. He didn't know when to stop. George read every letter, signed every document, and tried to follow every detail of every decision as if sheer micromanagement could rewind the world to when he still had colonies and a functional mood. This wasn't just stress. It was identity crisis in ermine. George had always seen his kingship as moral stewardship. He was the shepherd, the father, the not at all cool but very reliable dad of the empire. But how do you continue being father of the nation when your metaphorical kids just took the carriage and bolted across the Atlantic with no intention of writing? Even the arts got in on the pity party. Caricaturists and pamphlet writers mocked him with increasing enthusiasm, often portraying George as either a tyrant or a fool, sometimes both, depending on how much ink they had. One infamous cartoon showed him being chased by an angry American eagle while wearing a dunce cap made of tea bags. Cartoonists had no chill, and while his face was still on the coins, the national sentiment was tarnished. Confidence in the monarchy declined, and although George remained popular among some loyalists, many questioned whether his tight grip had strangled Britain's colonial future. Even the monarchy's traditional allies began tiptoeing around him like he might spontaneously combust into a royal tantrum if someone mentioned Boston too loudly. George, meanwhile, was doing his best impersonation of a man who had it all together while slowly unraveling at the seams. His letters grew more erratic. His conversations veered into the nonsensical. He talked endlessly, sometimes for hours, without pausing, like a human podcast with no off switch and questionable reception. Court physicians began to worry. So did his advisors. So did his family. The term melancholia was tossed around, though 18th century medicine generally lumped mental illness under either bad humors or have you tried bleeding him. And yet, he tried to carry on. George didn't take a vacation. He didn't binge watch plays at the Globe and eat his feelings in trifles. Instead, he just kept ruling, badly, sometimes, obsessively, often, with increasing emotional turbulence, always. But perhaps the most poignant detail of all was how genuinely betrayed he seemed to feel. George didn't just lose a war, he lost something he'd believed in. His was not the rage of a tyrant ousted, but the sorrow of a parent left behind. And that grief didn't stay politely bottled up. It began to seep out in public appearances, in policy misfires, and in very audible mutterings to nearby shrubbery. The man who had once been hailed as the moral monarch, the clean-cut farmer king, was now seen wandering his gardens with a faraway look and something disconcertingly close to a monologue. And though no one dared say it to his face, the court was whispering something wasn't right with George. Coming up next, we enter even stranger territory, because while George's mind began to bend under the weight of loss and responsibility, his behavior was about to grow even more bizarre and more botanical. By the late 1780s, King George III wasn't just feeling blue, he was sprinting headlong into a technicolor storm of mental chaos. If the American Revolution had cracked his royal composure, what came next shattered the rest. This wasn't your run-of-the-mill burnout. George wasn't just stressed, he was enthusiastically unraveling in full embroidered regalia, dragging the entire royal court along for the dizzying ride. Let's start with the early warning signs. At first, it was easy to mistake George's behavior for quirky monarch energy. He'd talk for hours without stopping, and not just about serious matters of state. No, he'd veer wildly off course from parliamentary reform to the virtues of turnip farming, all within a single breathless monologue. It wasn't just that he talked a lot, it was how he talked. His letters and journals began to sprawl into monstrous paragraphs, one famously clocking in at over 400 words without a single period. If punctuation is the brake pedal of language, George had his foot firmly on the gas and had driven off a grammatical cliff. Now, manic verbosity might sound quaint. Oh look, the king's rambling again, how eccentric, until you realize he was also talking so fast that even seasoned courtiers couldn't keep up. The man was practically freestyling history lectures at 200 beats per minute. Add in the fact that he frequently repeated himself, sometimes dozens of times, and you start to see why people were nervously eyeing the exits during royal audiences. The only thing more exhausting than being King George was listening to him be King George. Then came the physical signs. George's behavior began to border on the theatrical. He gesticulated wildly, flailed his arms, paced incessantly, and talked to inanimate objects, sometimes affectionately, sometimes accusingly. According to servants and insiders, he once greeted a tree as the King of Prussia, And it wasn't just idle chatter. George would bow to it, salute it, possibly ask it for advice. If that tree ever published memoirs, the royal family might have had another scandal on their hands. At meals, things didn't improve. His Majesty began shouting at his cutlery, holding loud arguments with his dinner fork like it had personally insulted the monarchy. Rumors circulated that he gave scathing rebukes to empty chairs. It's one thing to be a monarch. It's another to turn your dining room into an improvised courtroom where spoons are the jury. Meanwhile, the doctors of the time were little help. These were the days when medical science operated on a blend of guesswork, leeches, and a vague sense of optimism. The leading theory, too much blood. So naturally they drained it. When that didn't work, they prescribed blistering mustard plasters and a particularly barbaric favorite, restraint chairs. In other words, George's condition was met not with compassion or understanding, but with 18th century medieval madness therapy. Nothing says healing like a session of medically sanctioned torture. One of his physicians, Dr. Francis Willis, did introduce a more humane approach by the era's standards: talk therapy and a calm environment. Revolutionary. Of course, it still involved strapping George into a straitjacket on occasion, but baby steps. Willis would go on to treat George during future episodes, but during this first major spell in 1788, no one really knew what to do. The court was in chaos, Parliament froze, and the Prince George's son was already circling like a vulture, hoping to take over as regent. Imagine trying to get better while your child stands over your sickbed rehearsing his acceptance speech. Through it all, George's affliction was deeply misunderstood. Today, many historians believe he suffered from a condition called porphyria, a rare metabolic disorder that can affect the nervous system and cause symptoms eerily similar to what George experienced: confusion, mania, hallucinations, and yes, tree diplomacy. But back then, without modern science or psychology, his behavior was just chalked up to madness. And worse, it was public. The king's breakdown wasn't private, it was a national spectacle. Satirical prints filled newspapers, rumors spun wildly. You couldn't sneeze in London without someone whispering, "Have you heard what George did this time?" What made it especially tragic was that this wasn't a permanent decline. George would recover, at least temporarily. That first intense episode in 1788 subsided, and for a time he returned to his duties. But something had changed. The royal court had seen the cracks in the crown, and they weren't going to forget it anytime soon. For the first time, the question wasn't just, is the king ruling wisely, but is the king even capable of ruling at all? It's a strange, heartbreaking, and occasionally hilarious chapter in British history. A king who once lectured on crop rotation now debated with shrubbery. A monarch born to rule an empire couldn't even convince his subjects he was sane. And yet, in many ways, George's descent marked the beginning of a shift, away from absolute monarchs toward constitutional caution, with Parliament slowly pulling more of the levers behind the scenes. Next up, we'll explore how George tried to bounce back publicly and painfully. Let's just say the monarchy tried to put a fresh coat of paint over some very obvious cracks. By the time George III started making conversation with the local oak population, the British public had stopped whispering about his condition and started full-on speculating whether the monarch had permanently relocated to the deep end of the royal sanity pool. Because, let's be honest, when your king starts addressing shrubbery as if they're members of Parliament, it's not just a quirky new gardening hobby, it's a national concern. The infamous tree talks have become the headline act in the tragic comedy that was George's later reign. It wasn't just a rumor that grew out of nowhere. Several courtiers, servants, and baffled groundskeepers reported witnessing the king pacing through the gardens of Kew, tipping his hat, bowing and muttering animatedly to towering trees as though they were his most trusted advisors. Some accounts even claim he addressed an old chestnut as Lord North, the very prime minister who oversaw the loss of the American colonies. If that's not emotional baggage in photosynthesis form, I don't know what is. It's important to note that 18th and 19th century medicine didn't exactly have a firm grasp on mental health. If you were suffering from paranoia, delusions, or even just too many emotions, The response was often apply leeches and pray for a cold winter. So when George began showing signs of severe mental instability, talking to trees, misidentifying courtiers and laughing at jokes that hadn't been told, his physicians weren't quite sure if he was suffering from demonic possession, dietary imbalance, or just really into landscaping. To make matters more complicated, historians now believe that George's madness may not have been psychological in origin at all. There's a theory that he was suffering from porphyria, a rare genetic disorder that affects the nervous system and can cause everything from abdominal pain and muscle weakness to confusion, hallucinations, and paranoia. Imagine dealing with intense pain, no sleep, distorted reality, and no ibuprofen. It's no wonder he ended up debating with the birch trees. But back to the botany. For George, the trees weren't just trees. They were his comfort zone, his safe audience. People, well, bark-covered approximations of people who didn't talk back, didn't betray him, and didn't question his logic. After decades of betrayal, revolution, personal loss, and upheaval, trees might have seemed like a better bet than his own ministers. They were sturdy, dependable, and never once dumped tea into a harbour. One particularly detailed and widely repeated anecdote describes George greeting a large oak with the phrase, "Sir, your loyalty to the crown is exemplary," and then proceeding to have a detailed discussion about military strategy with it. Whether or not this specific conversation occurred exactly as described is up for debate, but the fact that multiple observers from palace staff to visiting dignitaries commented on the king's arboreal diplomacy says a lot about how public his condition had become. This wasn't something hidden away in dark palace corners. It was the monarchy unraveling in real time with leaves and twigs involved. And yet there's a certain tragedy to this image of a once revered monarch reduced to strolling among branches in search of companionship. The press mocked him. The public grew uncomfortable. People scrambled to manage both the embarrassment and the chaos. But behind all that was a man aged, exhausted, tormented by an invisible force that made the world around him unrecognizable. What the public saw as madness, he might have experienced as isolation so profound that only the trees felt real. There's also the poetic irony that George, the king who oversaw the transformation of Britain into a global empire, ended up retreating into a world where his only parliament had roots in the ground and branches in the sky. He went from global strategist to woodland philosopher, and while it made for excellent tabloid fodder at the time, it also symbolized just how broken the man had become. And yet, part of you kind of has to admire the dedication. Most monarchs retire to stately reading rooms or take up fox hunting. George rewrote the book on royal hobbies by turning botanical hallucination into an art form. When he spoke to the trees, he wasn't just losing his grip, he was creating a strange leafy parallel court, one where the oaks were loyal, the maples never questioned orders, and the willows wept with him in solidarity. By the early 1800s, these incidents had made their way into the public domain, feeding caricatures and satire, especially from publications like Punch. Artists loved portraying the king mid-discussion with a tree, while ministers scratched their heads in the background. The monarchy had officially become a punchline, and unfortunately for George, the joke was sticking. Of course, in private, things weren't so funny. His children were terrified. His wife, Queen Charlotte, reportedly avoided being alone with him. His court became a carefully curated stage play where everyone tiptoed around the sovereign while trying not to disturb the growing thicket of delusions. Still, if we step back, there's a tragic sort of poetry to the king's arboreal obsession. In a world that had become too loud, too hostile, and too treacherous, George III chose to spend his final coherent years with the only subjects who never betrayed him, the trees. If you ever feel like your spa day went horribly wrong, maybe the aromatherapy smelled like burnt cabbage or the massage felt like a mugging, just remember at least no one tied you to a chair and called it medicine. King George III wasn't so lucky. When the mental fog rolled in and the monarchy needed answers, 18th century treatment arrived wearing powdered wigs, armed with leeches, and absolutely no medical degrees by today's standards. It was less about understanding the mind and more about physically battering it into submission. Welcome to the royal medical circus, where every remedy was a terrifying mix of guesswork, desperation and something vaguely resembling torture. The theory of the time was simple. If something was wrong with you, you were probably full of bad humors. No, not bad jokes, though that would explain some royal decrees, but the ancient debunked belief in bodily fluids controlling health. Too much black bile? Time to bleed. Too much phlegm? Blister away. Mental illness? Easy. Let's drain your blood, isolate you in a locked room, and maybe chain you to the bed for good measure. For George, this wasn't a brief detour. It became the unfortunate routine of a king unraveling under medical misfires. One of the main stars in this medical horror show was Dr. Francis Willis, a man who believed in the healing powers of strict discipline and cold baths. Think boot camp for your brain, but with fewer push-ups and more psychological trauma. Willis wasn't a charlatan by 18th century standards. He was actually cutting edge. He had some success treating patients with what we'd now call psychiatric care, though his version of care looked a lot like punishment with a medical degree. When George was placed under his watch, the treatment plan resembled a week at the worst health retreat imaginable. Minimal food, harsh confinement, yelling, and of course the always chick application of blisters. Because when in doubt, burn something onto the skin and hope the madness evaporates with the pus. The blistering method was particularly grotesque. Physicians would apply hot plasters or even caustic substances to the king's skin to raise painful blisters. Why? Because the body had to be distracted, apparently. The logic was that creating external pain might somehow override internal distress. It's like stubbing your toe to forget a headache, except the toe is your entire back and the headache is untreated psychosis. And then there was bleeding. Poor George, already exhausted by mental anguish, was routinely bled, sometimes to the point of near collapse. The idea was to balance his system. In reality, it left him physically depleted, which only made the mental symptoms more erratic. It's hard to deliver coherent state policy when your body is working with half the blood it needs and your brain is being soaked in confused 18th century theories. Despite the barrage of cures, George had lucid moments. Sometimes he'd challenge his doctors with sharp, insightful questions, or make ironic remarks about the treatments themselves. One famous account has George accusing Dr. Willis of being mad instead, and honestly, given the tools Willis was using, he might not have been wrong. George's flashes of wit and awareness were reminders that inside the swirling fog of his illness was still a king who could think clearly, just not for long stretches, publicly. This wasn't something the court could easily hide. Word got out, pamphlets circulated, cartoons gleefully mocked the king's condition. In an age when monarchy was supposed to be stable, divine, and above reproach, watching your sovereign strapped to a chair with blistered skin and screaming into the void wasn't great for morale. Yet the treatments continued, because to do nothing was unthinkable, and to try something new, equally horrifying. It was a perfect storm of medical stagnation, social stigma, and institutional helplessness. What makes this whole ordeal more tragic is that George wasn't a king abandoned by his people or his family. He was surrounded by those who genuinely wanted him to get better, but their methods were shaped by ignorance, not cruelty. The line between compassion and torment was blurry when your medical textbook suggested demons might be involved, and your clinical trials consisted of whatever your mentor tried last week on a barmaid with hysteria. In the end, the treatments didn't cure George. They may have prolonged periods of calm, but at what cost? His physical health deteriorated, his mind fractured further, and the dignity of kingship was reduced to cries behind locked doors and the shuffle of leeches in a silver bowl. What comes next is the final chapter of this royal tragedy, where kingship becomes ceremonial, the crown becomes a shadow, and one man's mind drifts further from the throne. By the time George III was talking to oak trees and scolding his soup, Britain had entered what can only be described as a constitutional shrug. The king was, quite literally, not all there, and while the crown still gleamed atop his name, the actual business of ruling had to go on, preferably without anyone being lectured by shrubbery. Thus began the Regency era, a period when everyone nodded politely at the idea of monarchy, while also quietly slipping the decision-making to someone who hadn't just invited the rosebushes to Parliament. Enter the Prince of Wales, later George IV, a man with the spending habits of a high roller and the attention span of a distracted magpie. The public knew him well, and not always fondly. While his father had cultivated an image of pious restraint, trees aside, the younger George preferred lavish dinners, expensive mistresses, and tailors who charged by the rhinestone. If George III was the tragic Shakespearean monarch spiraling into madness, George IV was the reality TV spin-off that nobody asked for, but somehow still aired every week. But before the tiara fully passed down, Parliament had to perform a delicate dance. They couldn't exactly say the king has lost his marbles and now thinks the begonias are whispering state secrets, even though, well, he had. Instead, they framed the situation as temporary, a medical issue, a condition, a rough patch, and passed the Regency Act of 1811, which essentially benched George III and gave his son the royal whistle. He was named Prince Regent and given all the powers of the crown, minus the actual crown, and thankfully, minus the hallucinations. This wasn't the monarchy's first brush with crisis management, but it was definitely among its most awkward. Imagine explaining to the public that the monarch still technically ruled, except he also now thought the moon was spying on him. For Queen Charlotte, George's wife and quiet sufferer-in-chief, the whole situation was a slow-motion collapse. She had spent her life navigating court, raising 15 children, yes 15, and keeping up royal appearances. Now she was left as the emotional glue holding together a crumbling palace, a crumbling husband, and a court that pretended everything was just fine, except for the screams from the other room. Inside Windsor Castle, where George spent most of his later years, time seemed to stand still. The furnishings stayed unchanged, the doors stayed shut, and George, increasingly blind and deaf, wandered the halls in confusion. Meanwhile, outside the gates, the world marched on. Napoleon fell, industrial revolutions boomed, and people started writing novels instead of sword fighting over insults. Still, the image of the king, the real king, lingered in the national imagination. He had once been the stable hand of the British identity, the man who didn't flee when France burned or when Parliament bickered, and now he was a ghost in his own palace, technically sovereign, legally irrelevant, and occasionally attempting conversation with his reflection. The Prince Regent, meanwhile, took to ruling with all the decorum of a bored aristocrat handed a theme park. His tastes shaped the era. Think bright colours, bold architecture, and banquets that made Marie Antoinette look thrifty, while he lacked his father's discipline or connection to reality. To be fair, he embraced the moment with gluttonous flair. The Regency became its own aesthetic, a little more scandal, a little more sparkle, and a lot more debt. And through it all, Britain managed. Somehow it always did. Ministers governed, wars were fought and won, and the machinery of empire kept grinding forward, all while the king, the original George, faded into myth, the ruler who lost his colonies, lost his mind, and yet, in a strange way, never lost his title. It's one of history's quietest coups, a nation ruled by a man who didn't realize he was no longer ruling, replaced by a son who thought ruling meant redecorating everything in gold and flirting with opera singers. And yet the crown stayed on. The ceremony continued. The monarchy endured. Like a long call where the host forgot to unmute, Britain just kept talking over the static. History hasn't been kind to George III, mostly because history has a cruel sense of humour. It's remembered him not as a diligent ruler or a forward-thinking reformer, but as the guy who lost the country and then mistook an elm tree for an ambassador. If monarchs had yearbook quotes, his would be most likely to think a hydrangea is whispering secrets, but beneath the caricature of madness lies something more complicated and far more human. Let's start with the part that's easy to forget. George III reigned for 60 years. That's not a cameo, that's an entire box set. From 1760 to 1820, Britain transformed from a slightly dishevelled empire into a global behemoth. And while yes, the whole losing the colonies thing was a whoopsie of epic proportions, it didn't define his entire rule. If we judged every leader by their worst day, most of them wouldn't even make it into the history books, just a group therapy session. George was at heart a man who desperately wanted to do the right thing. He read obsessively, took his duties seriously, and believed in reform long before it was fashionable. While some kings spent their spare time inventing new taxes or hunting unicorns, looking at you, medieval Europe, George was busy learning astronomy, studying crop rotation, and building one of the finest libraries in Britain, which, for the record, he made available to scholars, because knowledge was for sharing, not hoarding. He loved farming. Genuinely. The man was nicknamed Farmer George, and while the press initially used it to poke fun at his rustic interests, it later became a term of affection. He promoted agricultural improvement, supported scientific research, and took an almost adorable interest in things like manure efficiency. Sure, he may have talked to trees, but he also wanted those trees to thrive in nutrient-rich soil. It's only in the past century that historians have started to re-evaluate his mental decline with a more compassionate lens. At the time, George's symptoms were a mystery wrapped in a medical shrug. He was mad, bewitched, or suffering divine punishment. Pick your 18th century diagnosis. But now, we have stronger evidence that George may have suffered from porphyria, a rare genetic disorder that can cause confusion, hallucinations, and that royal shade of purple urine doctors found so baffling. Others suggest he may have had bipolar disorder, with periods of manic verbosity followed by crushing depression. Either way, he wasn't cursed, he was sick, and unfortunately, treatment at the time involved things like blistering restraint chairs and the soothing sound of 18th century screaming. In hindsight, the real tragedy isn't that George III lost his mind. It's that no one knew how to help him. Instead, they isolated him, medicated him into silence, and let the public turn him into a national punchline. And yet, throughout it all, he remained deeply committed to his family, his faith, and the ideal that kings should serve their people. He wasn't delusional about his role, just tragically afflicted while trying to live it. Even public opinion, once so eager to mock, has softened over the centuries. In his final years, blind, deaf, and kept in secluded Windsor rooms, George III became a figure of national sympathy. He had outlived his wife, buried several children, and been stripped of nearly all his authority. But people began to recognize the strength it took just to keep going. The mad king became the enduring king, and perhaps that's his true legacy. Not just as the man who lost America, or the man who talked to oaks, but as a monarch who, in an age of excess and ego, genuinely cared. He believed in education, science, and the role of reason in governance, which makes the irony of his later madness all the more painful. He tried to bring order to a chaotic world, even as his own mind unraveled. Yes, he talked to trees, but he also tried to chart the stars, improve the soil, and make the monarchy a force for good. He lost colonies, but helped Britain survive wars, turmoil, and social transformation. He was mocked in his time and pitied after it, and now, perhaps finally, he's understood. In the end, George III wasn't just a punchline in powdered wigs. He was a man burdened with a crown and a condition, someone who tried his best, even when his mind wouldn't let him. His reign may have ended in silence, but his legacy is anything but quiet. Before Ada Lovelace was a pioneer of computer science, before she predicted that machines might one day compose music, or even before she met Charles Babbage and translated her way into immortality, she was simply the walking, breathing result of one of the most disastrous celebrity marriages in British history. Our tale begins in 1815, in the elegant but emotionally treacherous corridors of Regency London, where Lord Byron, yes, that Lord Byron, was busy being England's most scandalous poet and probably its worst husband. Famous for verses that made Victorian ladies swoon, and personal behaviour that made their husbands call for smelling salts, Byron was what you might get if you blended Shakespeare, rock and roll, and a court case. He once described himself as mad, bad, and dangerous to know, which is exactly what you want in a gothic anti-hero, and absolutely not what you want in the father of your child. And yet, Enter Lady Annabella Milbanke, devout, cerebral, and under the stunning misapprehension that she could fix him. Let's be clear, Annabella was no pushover. She was deeply religious, morally rigid, and so mathematically inclined that Byron himself nicknamed her the Princess of Parallelograms. Romantic stuff, right? Nothing says passion like a polygonal pet name. But Annabella, much to her later regret, believed her cool rationality could reform Byron's, well, Byronness. Spoiler, it didn't. Their marriage lasted exactly 1 year. By the time Ada was just 5 weeks old, Byron had already stormed out of the house, written several angry poems, and set sail for the continent, where he'd continue a life of poetic glory, battlefield tourism, and general emotional chaos. He never saw his daughter again, but Ada would grow up hearing plenty about him, mostly from her mother, who spoke of her ex-husband the way one might speak of a contagious disease. Annabella was determined, obsessed even with ensuring that little Ada would not inherit her father's melodrama. No romantic stargazing, no brooding by candlelight, no scandalous limericks, and absolutely no poetry. Instead, Ada got math, so much math. While other children were learning nursery rhymes and pretending the floor was lava, Ada was being tutored in geometry, logic, and Latin. Picture a toddler being handed Euclid instead of a teddy bear. Annabella's idea of bedtime stories probably involved the binomial theorem and a strongly worded warning about the dangers of metaphors. And if all that wasn't intense enough, Annabella also employed a rotating cast of moral chaperones and scientific tutors to keep her daughter's imagination chained to the desk like a misbehaving Victorian ghost. She wanted Ada's mind to grow orderly, precise, and safely uninspired by anything even remotely poetic. If emotion crept into the curriculum, it was asked to leave and escorted out politely. This had an unexpected effect. Instead of crushing Ada's creativity, it simply redirected it. She didn't stop imagining fantastical things. She just imagined fantastical machines, flying devices, elaborate calculation systems, logic-driven inventions that would have made Rube Goldberg feel underqualified. It turns out if you starve a mind of fairy tales but feed it calculus, it doesn't stop dreaming. It just starts dreaming in numbers. Ada grew up in a unique kind of isolation, brilliant but cloistered, privileged but lonely. She never knew her father, but his legacy was a spectre in her life. More warning sign than role model. Her mother monitored her closely, terrified that at any moment Ada might erupt into poetic rebellion, scribbling verses about forbidden love and Grecian urns. To ensure this didn't happen, Annabella insisted on structure. Ada's life was like one long spreadsheet formatted into human existence. Columns of behavior, rows of lessons, cells full of expectation. Yet, even in this rigid structure, Ada's intellect thrived. Her fascination with numbers wasn't just tolerated, it was encouraged, albeit as a shield against her genetic poetry. In truth, her imagination fused with math in ways no one could anticipate. While Lady Byron saw logic as the antidote to madness, Ada began to see it as a language, a way of dreaming with discipline. She wasn't just solving equations, she was seeing patterns, visualizing systems, wondering what could be created if numbers were given purpose. And somewhere deep down, her father's flair for drama didn't disappear. It just got smuggled into her scientific thinking. Ada didn't recite odes to nature's beauty. She wrote notes about how a machine might replicate its rhythms. It's tempting to say Ada was the perfect fusion of her parents, but really, she was something else entirely. Neither Byron's Tempest nor Annabella's spreadsheet. She was a singularity, a daughter of poetry and precision, who would one day write code for a machine that didn't exist yet. But before that moment of brilliance, she had to grow up, and before she could change the world, she had to meet someone who'd show her it was possible. In Regency-era England, educating girls was considered important, but only up to the point where they wouldn't embarrass themselves at a dinner party. A few piano lessons, some passable French, and just enough arithmetic to manage a dowry without accidentally selling off the family estate. Anything beyond that was considered excessive, dangerous, even. Women weren't supposed to be too clever. It made the men nervous. Ada Lovelace's education did not follow this genteel playbook. While other girls were learning embroidery and how not to faint in public, Ada was being rigorously trained to become what can only be described as a logic-powered war machine. This was not out of any enlightened feminist philosophy. No, this was her mother's doing. Lady Annabella, the one-woman anti-poetry task force. You remember her? She was determined to purge every molecule of Byronic melodrama from Ada's bloodstream. And what better antidote to romanticism than mathematics, science, and the cold, unyielding joy of trigonometry? Ada's early education began at home and stayed there. Schools were still for boys, and besides, no institution could have matched the paranoid precision Lady Byron demanded. Ada was assigned private tutors, some of them brilliant, others merely terrified, and all of them instructed to avoid any mention of creative writing, metaphors, or anything that might hint at a poetic imagination. Instead, her curriculum included arithmetic, algebra, Latin, astronomy, logic, and just for fun, mechanical engineering. By the time she was 12, Ada could probably calculate the velocity of a cannonball, while the other debutantes were still figuring out how many ribbons to attach to a bonnet. She didn't just excel at this bizarrely intense education, she thrived. One of her earliest tutors, the mathematician William Friend, described her as intensely eager to learn and understand everything. Imagine trying to explain Euclid's geometry to a child and watching her correct you. It was like being challenged to a chess match by a cat and then losing. Even more remarkable than Ada's ability to absorb information was what she did with it. She had an uncanny way of applying abstract concepts to real-world questions. She didn't just learn equations, she imagined how they could be used to build machines, simulate events, or solve problems no one else had thought to ask. By the age of 13, Ada was dreaming of flight, not metaphorical, philosophical, or poetic flight, but actual, mechanical, gear-powered flight. While other girls sketched wedding dresses, Ada sketched wings, not just vague doodles either. She produced detailed diagrams of bird anatomy, wind dynamics, and structural support systems. Her notebooks from this time are filled with calculations and questions like, what if the wings are too heavy for the frame? And could steam power be applied mid-air? And yes, she called this project her flyology, because of course she did. Ada Lovelace didn't do hobbies. She did research papers disguised as childhood whims. She also began experimenting with scientific observation. There's an account of her attempting to dissect the anatomy of birds by attaching wires to a dead pigeon, as one does, with the aim of understanding how muscle tension affected wing movement. It was a far cry from a tea party, and it alarmed the household staff enough that they quietly removed all remaining birds from the premises. But even with all this ambition, Ada was not a solitary recluse. Her wit, curiosity, and relentless enthusiasm earned her a reputation among her instructors. She became known, affectionately, as the Analyst, a nickname which sounds like either a spy code name or a superhero with a very niche power set. But in Ada's case, it was well earned. She could break down a complex system into its tiniest components, study each one, and then figure out how to rebuild it into something entirely new. She analyzed mathematics, certainly, but also logic, language, structure, and patterns. To her, the world was a giant system of interlocking codes, waiting to be unraveled. And she didn't just want to solve problems, she wanted to understand why the problems existed in the first place. Her growing fascination with machines was matched by a fascination with the philosophy of machines. Could a mechanical process mimic the human brain? Could numbers express more than quantity, perhaps even creativity? These were not idle questions. This was her brain warming up for the biggest intellectual leap of the century. Of course, none of this was considered appropriate for a girl. While her peers were being gently shepherded toward marriage and embroidery, Ada was being steered toward calculus and steam-powered fantasy. She wasn't rebellious exactly, she simply had no patience for the idea that her brain came with a gender label. In a world where most women's mental energy was directed toward hosting salons or avoiding scandal, Ada was dreaming of mechanical birds and mathematical theories so complex they made grown men blink in confusion. Her education had turned her into a force of nature, a mind shaped not just by numbers but by the raw curiosity of a child who looked at the world and wondered how it worked. She hadn't yet met Charles Babbage or seen his strange mechanical invention, but when she did, she would be ready, and she would understand it better than anyone else alive. If Regency romance novels were written for engineers, the story of Ada Lovelace and Charles Babbage would be the most emotionally reserved page-turner of them all. It had everything: a mysterious invention, a dramatic salon party, shared obsession over numbers, and the beginning of a brainy bond that would outlive them both. Spoiler: no one makes eye contact over candlelight, but a lot of eye contact is made over logarithmic functions. In June of 1833, 17-year-old Ada Lovelace was invited to a fashionable soiree, hosted by one of the few people in London capable of throwing both an intellectually rigorous and socially acceptable gathering, the polymath Mary Somerville. This was no ordinary tea party. The guest list read like a who's who of Victorian geekdom, and at the centre of it all was a man with wild ideas, sharper than average cheekbones, and absolutely no patience for stupidity. Charles Babbage. Babbage, then in his early 40s, was already infamous in scientific circles, not just for his inventions but also for his enthusiasm. He could rant about bad street musicians and the limitations of logarithmic tables in the same breath, both with the passion of someone on their fourth espresso. He wasn't charming in the conventional sense, but for Ada, he was electrifying. At the time, Babbage was working on his difference engine, a hulking, gear-driven, room-dominating mechanical calculator designed to eliminate human error from mathematical tables. Basically a glorified calculator the size of a piano, and just as temperamental. Most people viewed it with polite confusion, like it was either a scientific breakthrough or an elaborate prank. But Ada? She was transfixed. Babbage had arranged for a demonstration of a small piece of the machine, the Silver Dancer, a portion of the difference engine that when in motion moved with an eerie mechanical elegance. It was meant to impress the guests. It mostly bewildered them, but not Ada. While the others sipped punch and tried to look politely engaged, Ada leaned in, asked questions, smart questions, and understood the implications immediately. It was less love at first sight and more mental download at first gear turn. She saw what Babbage was building not as a curiosity but as a language. She understood the rhythm of it, the logic beneath the brass and bolts. Where others saw clunky machinery, Ada saw possibility, a machine that could replicate and even surpass human calculation. This wasn't just a cool parlor trick. It was a glimpse of the future. Babbage, for his part, was stunned. Most young women he encountered at parties did not interrogate him about mechanical functions. Most men, for that matter, didn't grasp the potential of his designs the way Ada did in minutes. He later described her as that enchantress of numbers, which sounds like a line from a math-themed opera, but in Victorian terms it was high praise. Their correspondence began soon after, and with it, a remarkable intellectual friendship was born. Ada wasn't just a curious bystander. She became his most enthusiastic and insightful student. She wanted to know everything: how the machine worked, how it stored values, how it could be programmed, and what its limitations were. Babbage, delighted to have someone who both understood and respected his work, shared freely. He sent her diagrams, drafts, and even notes he hadn't shared with other scientists. They began to communicate in an almost private dialect of diagrams, mathematics, and machine logic, like most friendships. It's worth noting here that Ada didn't just nod along. She challenged Babbage's assumptions. She pushed for clarity. She asked him what would happen if the machine was given not just numbers but symbols. Could it compose music? Could it mimic logic? Could it brace yourself think? This was decades before the word computer meant anything other than a person paid to sit at a desk and hate their life while doing long division. Their dynamic was simple but powerful. Babbage had the blueprints. Ada had the vision. He was building a machine. She was imagining a world where machines might one day do things. They made an ideal pairing, though not romantically. Ada was married by this point to Lord William King, later the Earl of Lovelace, a man with the good sense to mostly stay out of her intellectual way. Their relationship with Babbage was purely mental, a shared mindscape of gears, math, and theoretical possibilities. Like pen pals, but instead of discussing their cats, they debated theoretical algebraic loops. Their mutual respect became something rare in history, a partnership where neither overshadowed the other. Babbage's ideas were extraordinary, but disorganized. Ada's clarity gave them shape. She annotated, interpreted, expanded. He built machines with iron. She gave them meaning with words, and she wasn't done. Soon Ada would take all that mechanical wonder and theoretical power and write something no one had ever written before, the world's first algorithm intended for a machine. But not quite yet. First, she needed to see the next machine, the analytical engine. It would be bigger, bolder, and even more unfinished than the first. And Ada? She was ready to finish the part Babbage never could, understanding what it was truly capable of. If the 19th century had a tech expo, Charles Babbage's analytical engine would have been the main attraction. Parked in the center of a gilded exhibition hall, surrounded by scholars blinking at it like it had just asked them for a Wi-Fi password, it was enormous, theoretical, beautifully impractical, and almost entirely made of brass. A mechanical monument to ambition and imagination. It was a computer before the world even knew what computer meant. And while Charles Babbage may have built its bones, Ada Lovelace gave it a soul. But first, some gear-splaining. You may remember that Babbage's earlier creation, the difference engine, was designed to automate the production of mathematical tables. It crunched numbers, quite literally, by turning cogs and columns through a sequence of operations. The difference engine was like a really dedicated calculator that needed its own room and a maintenance crew. The analytical engine, however, was a completely different beast. If the difference engine was a calculator, the analytical engine was a computer, the first one ever conceptualized. And yes, it ran on punch cards and raw ambition. Let's break it down. Input, punch cards, inspired by the ones used in jacquard looms to weave complex textile patterns. These cards told the machine what to do. Processing, a mill, which is essentially the Victorian version of a CPU, where the arithmetic operations took place. Memory, a store, capable of holding numbers while the machine figured out what to do next. Output, it could print its results on actual paper, because even in 1840, everyone hated reading off the screen. Oh, and the whole thing ran on turning cranks, rotating axles, and enough gears to terrify a Swiss watchmaker. Electricity, nowhere in sight. This was computation at its most mechanical. Think of it as trying to download Excel using a steam engine and 3 tons of metal. To most people, the analytical engine was a novelty, or worse, an expensive fantasy. But Ada Lovelace saw something no one else did. Where others saw a giant math machine, she saw a general-purpose device, a thing that could do more than calculate. Ada understood that numbers were just symbols, and if a machine could manipulate symbols according to rules, it wasn't limited to math. It could do anything that followed logic. Let that sink in. In an era when the height of household technology was a self-writing teapot, Ada Lovelace looked at an unbuilt gear monster and predicted modern computing. In her mind, this wasn't just an automated number cruncher. This was a thinking machine, albeit a slow one, powered by cranks and furious optimism. She understood that the engine could be programmed. The punch cards didn't just have to tell it what numbers to calculate. They could tell it how to behave. They could define loops, conditional operations, sequences, instructions. In other words, code. She saw that these punch cards could carry commands that allowed the machine to repeat tasks, change actions based on results, and follow complex patterns, all the basic building blocks of modern programming. This was more than Victorian STEM curiosity. This was early algorithmic thinking, decades before the field even existed. And while Babbage himself focused on the hardware, tinkering with cogs, finessing his designs and grumbling about government funding, Ada focused on what the machine meant. She theorized that such a device could manipulate anything that could be reduced to symbols, not just math, but letters, notes, even images. In a sense, she foresaw digital multimedia at a time when digital meant fingers. As she put it, the analytical engine weaves algebraic patterns just as the jacquard loom weaves flowers and leaves, which is poetic, and yes, ironic, given her mother's lifelong vendetta against poetry. Turns out Ada had inherited her father's gift for metaphor. She just used it to describe logic loops instead of lost love. And while no working model of the analytical engine was ever built in Babbage's lifetime, it was too complex, too expensive, and too ahead of its time. Ada's vision of what it could do was the real innovation. Babbage had created the frame. Ada imagined the operating system. To use a thoroughly modern metaphor, Babbage invented the smartphone. Ada invented the App Store. She looked at 19th century hardware and saw Spotify. Everyone else saw a very confusing clock. She understood that machines could be more than machines. They could be tools of creation, not just calculation. Not everyone understood her at the time. Most, in fact, politely nodded and went back to worrying about their cravats. But history would catch up. Her insights would eventually be recognized as the first conceptual leap toward real programming, a philosophical foundation for everything from calculators to artificial intelligence. And she wasn't done yet. Ada would go on to write something that no one had ever written before, a full algorithm for the analytical engine. Not just a set of instructions, but a vision of how code could exist before a computer ever did. And naturally, she didn't publish it as a standalone paper. She tucked it like a brilliant secret weapon into a series of footnotes. But we'll get to that. In the grand tradition of women doing the most and getting the least credit, Ada Lovelace didn't just read a technical paper and nod politely. She dismantled it, rebuilt it, gave it a personality, and added an appendix so groundbreaking it could have sprouted its own university department. All this while the rest of polite society was busy debating which bonnet was appropriate for a light drizzle. The year is 1840. Charles Babbage had just given a lecture in Turin about his analytical engine, which, let's be honest, sounded like a fever dream with gears. Enter Luigi Federico Menabrea, an Italian engineer and future prime minister who transcribed the talk into French. His paper was thoughtful, detailed, and frankly dry enough to qualify as kindling, and so Ada was asked to translate it into English. But here's the twist. She didn't just translate it. She reimagined it. Ada's so-called notes were over 3 times longer than the original paper. If this had been a school assignment, she would have blown past the word count and still gotten extra credit. The original document was like, "This is what the machine does." Ada's notes were more like, "Here's what it could do, and by the way, I've mapped out a detailed hypothetical scenario in which it solves Bernoulli numbers because I had a free afternoon." Let's pause to appreciate this. Bernoulli numbers are no walk in the mathematical park. They're complex, finicky, and were the equivalent of intellectual weightlifting in the 19th century. Ada wasn't content to say the analytical engine could calculate. She wanted to show it in action, and she did it with a step-by-step algorithm that most modern coders would recognize in structure. Loops? Check. Variables? Check. Memory storage? Absolutely. Debugging? Well, not yet, but give her a few more footnotes and she probably would have invented that too. What Ada produced wasn't just math, it was a blueprint for machine logic. She described how the engine could be programmed, a word that didn't even exist in this context yet, to follow sequences of instructions. She saw that it could branch, iterate, and reference values. In short, she saw the future, and the future was full of ones, zeros, and very tired programmers. Here's the kicker. All this revolutionary thinking was embedded in the footnotes. Not the main body, not the headline, not even a sidebar. She tucked the first computer program in the literary equivalent of a by the way. This is the same energy as discovering the theory of relativity, scribbled on the back of a shopping list. The real miracle is how she didn't let the expectations of her time muzzle her intellect. Victorian England wasn't exactly handing out world's best programmer mugs to women. In fact, if Ada had spent her time sketching table linens or learning to pour tea without making eye contact, she probably would have been praised more. But no, she insisted on understanding, questioning, and most dangerously of all, publishing her ideas. And her tone, it wasn't demure or hesitant. She wrote with the confidence of someone who'd outlogic a steam-powered juggernaut before lunch. At one point she criticizes Menabrea for underestimating the machine's capabilities. Another note casually introduces the idea that machines could manipulate symbols, not just numbers. That meant music, art, language, the building blocks of creativity. In essence, Ada was already imagining artificial intelligence before most people had figured out the telegraph. And yet, her contributions went mostly unnoticed for decades, partly because her work was ahead of its time, and partly because she was a woman, and history has the memory of a goldfish when it comes to crediting women in science. Babbage, bless his mechanical heart, praised her brilliance. But Ada's name wouldn't truly resurface until the 20th century, when actual computers finally caught up with what she envisioned. Let's also remember, she did all of this without a computer, or electricity, or Google. This was raw cognitive horsepower, fueled by imagination, mathematics, and a stubborn refusal to play dumb. She didn't have debugging tools, just ink, paper, and a brain that could outthink a brass engine designed by a man who occasionally forgot to finish building things. Ada's algorithm is now considered the world's first computer program, and she wrote it not in a lab, but in the margins. That's where women of her era were expected to stay on the edges of things. But Ada didn't just write in the margins. She redefined what the margins could contain. So the next time your computer freezes mid-email or your app crashes during an update, just know it all started with a woman scribbling loops and variables next to a translated lecture, probably while sipping tea and fending off a migraine. She may not have lived to see her code run, but she wrote the rulebook before the game even existed. Being a countess in Victorian England came with a strict dress code, a schedule full of social obligations, and if you were Ada Lovelace, a hobby of inventing the future of technology. Most women were expected to embroider cushions. Ada, on the other hand, was trying to figure out how to get a brass machine to store information. The contrast was so absurd, it would have made a satirical play if it hadn't been painfully real. Let's begin with the titles. By the time Ada had really started to delve into serious work with Charles Babbage, she had acquired the lofty title of Countess of Lovelace through her marriage to William King, who later became Earl of Lovelace. This made Ada technically nobility, which meant she had to juggle being both a trend-setting lady of high society and a relentless mathematical visionary. Imagine debugging code while someone is asking whether lace gloves or silk mittens are more fashionable this season. Ada's life was Regency glam on the outside, with advanced algorithmic thinking on the inside. Her marriage, like most aristocratic unions, was more about social standing than shared interest in the future of computing. William King was a respectable husband by Victorian standards, supportive enough not to burn her math notes, but also not exactly a collaborator. He didn't oppose her intellectual pursuits, but he probably understood them as well as the average person understands quantum physics during a power outage. Ada had children with him, but maternal bliss wasn't quite her natural element. She once described childbearing as a dreadful occupation, which, to be fair, it was in an era when anesthesia was still considered a radical and suspicious idea. Still, Ada tried to do it all. She wrote letters filled with complex algorithmic theory, and also made sure her household didn't fall into social disgrace for serving the wrong brand of tea. Victorian expectations for women were firmly nailed to the floor, but Ada seemed determined to tunnel under them with a slide rule and a dry wit. Society expected demure compliance. Ada offered annotated mathematics and a personality that could knock over a fainting couch with a single sarcastic eyebrow raise. Then there was the matter of her health. Ada was frequently ill. She had contracted measles as a child, which left her partially paralyzed for a time, and her adult life was a revolving door of migraines, digestive issues, and mystery ailments that Victorian doctors treated with a cocktail of opium, arsenic, and prayer. Sometimes all at once. Her health struggles were serious and debilitating, and they limited her ability to work consistently. But despite being bedbound more often than not, she still managed to produce visionary ideas that wouldn't be understood for another century. In between attending balls she didn't care about and recovering from illnesses she couldn't explain, Ada found time to push the boundaries of thought. She imagined machines manipulating symbols in ways that mimicked human reasoning, a concept that would later become the foundation of modern computing. She even speculated that a machine might one day compose music or create art if programmed correctly. Meanwhile, her contemporaries were still using quills and getting winded by long division. Let's pause and reflect. Ada Lovelace envisioned machine-generated music before radio even existed. She pondered artificial intelligence before electricity was in widespread use. And she did this in a corset so tight it could probably compress a small planet. It's also worth noting how isolating her intellect must have been. There were few people Ada could talk to about her ideas, certainly not during a polite garden party over tea and cucumber sandwiches. She sometimes corresponded with scientific minds of her era, but she was always an outlier, a woman in a man's field, an aristocrat in a realm of working engineers, and a theoretician in a society that still thought women's brains might overheat if used too vigorously. She even had a few false starts along the way. At one point she explored the idea of building a calculus of the nervous system, essentially a mathematical model of how thought processes worked. Today we'd call that a theory of neural networks or cognitive computing. Back then it was dismissed as one woman's overly ambitious fever dream. But Ada didn't stop dreaming. If anything, she dreamed harder. The most tragic part, she didn't live long enough to see even the tiniest glimmer of what she had helped to spark. Ada died at the age of 36, just like her father, Lord Byron, from cancer, after enduring months of agony and more Victorian medicine, more opium, more leeches, and probably a stern lecture about morality from someone wearing a powdered wig. In her too short life, Ada existed in contradiction, a brilliant logician in a world that prized emotional restraint over intellectual ambition, especially in women, a visionary coder in an era where code didn't yet exist, and a noble woman who looked at the future and saw circuits, not corsets. She was the Countess of Lovelace, but more impressively, she was the mother of modern computing, and while her world might have preferred her to waltz quietly into the history books, Ada danced her way in with algorithms instead, and then left the rest of us centuries behind trying to catch up. At some point, brilliance starts to feel a little like a fever dream, and for Ada Lovelace, that was often quite literal. By her early 30s, Ada's body was doing what Victorian bodies loved to do, slowly, mysteriously falling apart while doctors offered a grab bag of medical cures that ranged from useless to borderline witchcraft. Add in the era's fondness for masking symptoms rather than addressing causes, and you had a very bad time in a very elegant dress. Ada had always struggled with health. From childhood onward, she was plagued by everything from migraines to gastrointestinal woes. In 1837, at the age of 21, she suffered a particularly brutal bout of measles that left her temporarily paralyzed and bedridden for nearly a year. That alone would have been enough to sideline anyone's career. But Ada wasn't anyone, and she had too many equations bouncing around in her brain to stay still for long. Unfortunately, her treatments were the Victorian version of a medical shrug: leeches, bloodletting, and endless prescriptions of opiates, particularly laudanum, the period's go-to panacea, which was essentially liquid opium with a dash of alcohol for flair. Ada was rarely without a vial of it, using it for pain, anxiety, insomnia, and presumably to make tea parties more tolerable. Now, being frequently high on narcotic tinctures might dull the edge of physical suffering, but it did little for one's grip on reality. As Ada's body faltered, her mind began to take some interesting detours. She didn't just believe in numbers. She began to believe that numbers were alive, that they pulsed with divine intention. She called her approach poetical science, a kind of spiritual arithmetic, where mathematics could reveal the secrets of the universe if only you knew how to listen. To be fair, this was still less weird than most Victorian seances. Ada's journals and letters from this time became increasingly intense, filled with references to dreams, visions, and revelations about the nature of intelligence, both human and mechanical. She saw herself as a prophet of logic, someone chosen to bridge the gap between art and engineering, soul and circuit. Where others saw gears and punch cards, Ada saw destiny and design. In a time when women were discouraged from thinking too deeply about anything beyond embroidery patterns, this was practically intergalactic thinking. Her beliefs weren't entirely out of place. The 19th century was a boom time for mystical science, mesmerism, phrenology, alchemy. The Victorians loved nothing more than dressing up superstition in a lab coat. But Ada's version had something those others didn't: actual, testable, brilliant ideas behind it. By this point, her working relationship with Charles Babbage had cooled somewhat. He was still tinkering with designs for his never-built analytical engine, but Ada wanted more. She didn't just want to write about theoretical computing power, she wanted to build it. She proposed, boldly and perhaps naively, that the two of them raise funds and collaborate on constructing a full-scale analytical engine, one that would finally realize all the capabilities she'd laid out in her legendary footnotes. Babbage, being Babbage, balked at the idea of anyone, let alone a woman, taking the lead on his brainchild. The partnership fizzled, the machine never materialized, and Ada, emotionally and physically drained, faded back into illness, with a growing sense that her great opportunity had slipped through her fingers. But her ambitions didn't dim. As her health worsened, she became fixated on legacy, on ensuring her work would be recognized not as a footnote to Babbage, but as a foundational moment in the history of computing. She wrote letters feverishly, trying to rekindle collaborations, reassert her vision, and protect her intellectual contributions. She knew what she'd done, even if the rest of the world wouldn't understand it for another 100 years. In her final years, Ada dabbled increasingly in what she called metaphysical mathematics, the belief that numbers could describe not just the physical universe, but the spiritual one. This fusion of intuition and logic, of inspiration and structure, was the culmination of everything she'd always been, her mother's daughter and her father's. She had tried her whole life to reject Byron's poetic madness, but perhaps in the end she simply reinvented it with equations. Ada Lovelace died in 1852 at just 36 years old from uterine cancer, her final months agonizing, her treatment still steeped in Victorian quackery. In a grim twist of fate, she was buried next to her father, the very man her mother had tried to erase from her influence. Poetry and math side by side, she didn't live to see her visions realized. She never built a machine, never held a punch card in her hand as it hummed to life. But in her haze of opium dreams and number-fueled revelations, she had seen something no one else had, a future where machines wouldn't just calculate, they'd think, and that future still had her fingerprints all over it. Ada Lovelace died at the age of 36, but the timeline of her legacy is a bit like her famous footnotes, long, complex, and not immediately appreciated. At the time of her death, the world barely understood what she had done. She wasn't a household name, there were no Ada Lovelace Day hashtags, and nobody had built the machine she wrote for. In short, the algorithm existed, but the hardware and the public interest was still in beta, and by beta we mean buried in a desk drawer somewhere between Queen Victoria's knitting patterns and a pamphlet on phrenology. Her death in 1852 came after a long and painful decline from uterine cancer. In a tragic Victorian twist, the treatments she received were about as effective as trying to fix a broken clock by smashing it with a teacup. Her doctors, full of that unique 19th century confidence that paired medical ignorance with impeccable sideburns, prescribed a generous regimen of bloodletting, opiates and prayers. It didn't help. By the end she was bedridden, dependent on laudanum, and under the heavy influence of her mother, who controlled access to her visitors and her final moments. Despite being a countess, Ada's death was quiet. Her obituary didn't mention her work on the analytical engine. There were no tributes in scientific journals. Even Babbage, her brilliant, stubborn collaborator, didn't manage to publish a glowing eulogy. Instead, Ada Lovelace was buried, by her own request, beside the father she never knew, Lord Byron, the rock star poet of the Romantic era. If you're wondering whether that's a fitting ending or a weird posthumous family reunion, you're not alone. Byron, after all, had left Ada's mother shortly after she was born, died in Greece, and spent his lifetime scandalizing Europe. Ada spent hers trying to distance herself from his drama by inventing math for machines that didn't exist yet. Still, there they lay, side by side in a Nottinghamshire church, with poetry and programming united under a marble slab. After her death, Ada's notes, the ones that contained what's now considered the world's first computer program, gathered dust, quite literally. Victorian England wasn't exactly a tech incubator, and Charles Babbage's analytical engine was never completed. He had tried. Oh, how he tried. But he was that special brand of genius, whose ideas were 10 years ahead of the tools and 15 years ahead of the budget. Without a working machine, Ada's algorithm remained a beautiful blueprint for a non-existent future. For most of the 19th and early 20th centuries, Ada Lovelace was remembered, if at all, as a quirky noblewoman who dabbled in numbers, a scientific footnote herself. The real revival didn't start until the mid-20th century, over 100 years after she jotted her historic notes in the margins. With the rise of real computers, people finally started combing through the history of early computing theory. And lo and behold, there she was, a visionary who had predicted software before anyone had even agreed on what electricity was for. This rediscovery was slow, like rebooting Windows 95 on a rainy day. In the 1950s and 60s, scholars began publishing and translating her work again. By the 1970s, Ada became a feminist tech icon, a kind of Regency-era Rosie the Riveter with a tiara and a logarithmic table. The US Department of Defense even named a programming language after her in Still, even today, her legacy competes with better-known male counterparts. Alan Turing gets statues, films, and Benedict Cumberbatch. Ada gets a commemorative day on the tech calendar and a small bust in a museum gift shop. That's not to say she's unrecognized. Quite the opposite. The tech community has embraced her. Historians rave about her foresight, but the general public still sometimes mistakes her for a footnote in Babbage's story, when in reality, Babbage was a chapter in hers. What's most remarkable isn't just what Ada envisioned, but when she envisioned it. In an era when most people thought machines could only crunch numbers, she imagined them composing music, analyzing data, and mimicking human thought. She saw the poetic potential in circuits before there were even circuits. She didn't just predict the future, she practically pre-wrote it, then died before it began. So yes, Ada Lovelace passed away quietly, but her ideas, much like the punch cards she championed, kept running in the background, waiting for the world to catch up. Ada Lovelace didn't live to see her ideas take shape, but then again, time was never really her playground. She belonged to the 1800s by birth, but her brain had already leased space in the 21st century. While most Victorian women were expected to leave a legacy of well-arranged parlours and maybe a few strategically brilliant tea parties, Ada left us something entirely different, a vision of machines that could think creatively. It just took the rest of us about 150 years to catch up. After her death in 1852, Ada Lovelace was mostly remembered, if at all, as the eccentric daughter of Lord Byron. The genius, the algorithms, the machine memory, the loops, the proto-artificial intelligence, all shelved, not because people didn't care, but because the machine she'd envisioned didn't exist yet. Imagine trying to sell someone on Spotify in 1843. They'd ask where to load the coal. But Ada's notes survived, like an old vinyl record waiting to be rediscovered by hipsters. Her work sat quietly in academic archives, occasionally dusted off by a curious scholar here or a punch card enthusiast there. And then the 20th century came roaring in with a lot of wires, switches, blinking lights, and finally, the ability to understand what she was talking about. The true revival of Ada Lovelace's legacy began in the mid-20th century, right around the time computers started moving from warehouse-sized math monsters into something more well, programmable. In 1953, her notes were republished in a scientific journal, and suddenly, computer pioneers started connecting the dots. Wait, that lady in the corset understood algorithms before we invented computers? This recognition snowballed through the decades. Historians, computer scientists, and feminists all started revisiting her work. Each found something to marvel at: the elegance of her logic, the poetic phrasing of her technical ideas, and the fact that she had predicted modern computing before electricity was even a household concept. It's as if Ada looked at a bunch of gears and imagined Google Translate. In 1980, the Department of Defense, not an institution known for subtle tributes, named a programming language after her. ADA, all caps, very official. This wasn't just a nod, it was a full-on salute. ADA became the language of choice for mission-critical systems, like aviation, space exploration, and military operations. You know, the kind of stuff Ada would have loved to debug over tea. The ADA language was designed for reliability, structure, and clarity. All things Ada herself appreciated in a world where Victorian fashion included crinolines but no calculators. And just like that, her legacy wasn't just a historical footnote. It was now literal code keeping satellites in orbit and planes in the air. In 2009, Ada Lovelace Day was launched by tech journalist Sue Charman-Anderson. The goal? To celebrate women in STEM and finally give Ada the standing ovation she deserved, albeit posthumously. The second Tuesday of October became her annual curtain call. Across the globe, events are held where women in science, tech, engineering, and math are celebrated, mentored, and remembered, all in the name of a countess who saw music in mathematics. Ada Lovelace Day has turned into a powerful symbol. It reminds the world that women have always contributed to science and tech, even if history forgot to send them an invite to the Nobel banquet. What makes Ada's legacy so compelling isn't just what she did, it's what she foresaw. She didn't think of machines as cold calculators, but as instruments of art and creativity. She imagined them composing music, making pictures, generating ideas. Machine learning, algorithmic pattern recognition. These are concepts that align shockingly well with Ada's 1843 predictions. It's not just eerie, it's borderline prophetic, and as artificial intelligence continues to evolve, Lovelace's poetic vision of machines dancing with data becomes more relevant, not less. Ada Lovelace has become more than just a name in a textbook. She's a symbol of curiosity, creativity, and defiance. Defiance of expectations, of limitations, of the idea that genius has a fixed gender. Her code never ran on any machine in her lifetime, but it runs through every device we use today. She imagined a future where logic and imagination walked hand in hand, and now, that future is our present. So yes, we have Wi-Fi, memes, and programming languages she couldn't have dreamed of by name. But we also have Ada to thank for dreaming them into existence anyway. She didn't just predict the computer age, she shaped it, footnote by footnote. And if Ada had lived to see this digital dawn, there's no doubt she would have been running a poetry generator with one hand and debugging its code with the other, all while correcting your calculus and composing a waltz. Because genius doesn't need permission. It just needs a good set of punch cards. Before satellites, Doppler radar, and weather apps that still manage to be wrong half the time, humanity relied on vibes. That's not an exaggeration. In the pre-barometer world, weather prediction was an unholy blend of superstition, astrology, and whatever the local goat was doing that morning. Let's rewind to a simpler and soggier time. Imagine living in a world where a sudden thunderstorm wasn't just inconvenient, it was a divine judgment. No umbrellas, no forecasts, no 5-minute warning from your smartwatch. Just boom, you're wet and probably cursed. Weather was a cosmic lottery. If the harvest failed, it was clearly because the gods were displeased, or because someone in the village skipped church. People prayed for rain, danced for rain, sacrificed animals for rain, basically everything except developing an actual weather model. And when things went especially wrong, you guessed it, witches, thunderstorms, and hail were often blamed on weather magic. and there are actual trial records of women being executed for summoning tempests. Imagine being burned at the stake for simply having frizzy hair in high humidity. Early weather forecasting was a curious mix of folklore and farmyard diagnostics. Shepherds noticed their sheep huddled together before a storm. Farmers watched ants build taller hills and assumed that meant a wet season. And then there were the goats. If old Billy refused to leave the barn, you might want to cancel that outdoor jousting tournament. Human knees also entered the predictive lineup. Aching joints were believed to sense changes in air pressure, which, ironically, is kind of true. Your grandma's bad hip might be more reliable than your local meteorologist. We just didn't have a barometer to prove it yet. People also turned to the skies with the seriousness of medieval astronomers. The color of the sunset? Prophetic. The direction of the wind? Ominous. The shape of clouds? Literally divine messages. There were even books, actual scientific manuscripts, describing what a greenish hue in the sky might mean. And don't forget astrology. The position of Jupiter could allegedly warn of an upcoming thunderstorm. Mercury in retrograde might signal drought. And if all else failed, one simply blamed it on Saturn being a jerk. Of course, this wasn't just ancient people being overly dramatic, okay, maybe a little. Weather genuinely dictated survival. Entire civilizations rose and fell depending on the success of their harvests, which in turn depended on rainfall, temperature, and seasonal timing. Merchants needed favorable winds to carry their ships. Armies needed dry roads and clear skies to move troops and not die of pneumonia. Peasants needed to know when to plant wheat and when to huddle inside and pray for their mud roofs to hold. In many ways, weather was a god, fickle, unpredictable, and very much in charge. The ability to understand it even slightly could mean the difference between thriving and famine, between trade prosperity and shipping disasters, between a king's victory and his very damp, very cold downfall. Before barometers came along with their shiny tubes and actual science, the world's weather forecasters were mostly educated guesses wrapped in ceremonial robes. Ancient Greek philosophers like Aristotle wrote long-winded treatises on meteoros, mixing real observations with myths, moon cycles, and bird gossip. In ancient China, court astrologers would spend years studying seasonal cycles, lunar eclipses, and turtle shells. Yes, turtle shells. To give the emperor a 5-year weather plan. If the harvest went south, the astrologer often did too, usually via execution. Medieval Europe had its own share of self-styled weather experts, often monks or scholars who dabbled in meteorological philosophy. But again, they had no instruments, just eyes, clouds, and the occasional chicken's behavior to go on. You might think these people were completely wrong all the time, but here's the surprising bit. Sometimes they were right, because seasons follow patterns, animals react to pressure changes, and even broken weather monks are correct twice a decade. So to summarize, the pre-barometer world was damp, dangerous, and dependent on dubious sources. Your weather forecast came from a goat, a philosopher, or a sky-gazing farmer who hadn't seen a bath since the last eclipse. But all of that was about to change, because someone in a moment of pure brilliance would look at a glass tube, some liquid metal, and a vacuum, and think, I bet this can tell me if I should cancel my picnic. But before the mercury rises, we must meet the man who invented it, and the delightful, dangerous vacuum he created just to prove a point. In the grand theatre of 17th century science, where powdered wigs were enormous and egos even bigger, one Italian man dared to do the unthinkable, suck the air out of a tube. His name was Evangelista Torricelli, and he wasn't trying to start a weather revolution. He was just trying to understand why pumps in Tuscan mines weren't doing their job. Little did he know that his curiosity would create the very first barometer and shake the philosophical foundations of Europe harder than a thunderclap over the Vatican. To appreciate Torricelli's feat, you have to understand the times. This was an era where air wasn't just invisible stuff you breathed. It was still considered one of the classical elements along with earth, fire, and water. Air was mysterious. Air was life. Air was not to be tampered with. Enter Torricelli, a mathematician and physicist, but also a student of Galileo, who had the audacity to ask, what happens if we remove the air entirely? At the time, miners in Florence had been struggling with a mechanical issue. Suction pumps could only lift water about 10 meters high, anything higher, and the water just stopped. Local scholars speculated it was because nature would allow no more. Science, apparently, had outsourced the explanation to divine bureaucracy. Galileo had his own theories but passed away before solving the riddle, so the scientific torch, and possibly his last bottle of wine, was passed to Torricelli. Torricelli hypothesized that it wasn't that nature refused to lift water higher, it was that the weight of the atmosphere was pressing down on the water. That invisible air, so often taken for granted, was heavy, but to prove this, he'd need to isolate it, and thus began the first successful experiment in atmospheric pressure. Torricelli's laboratory was no high-tech lab. Picture this: a glass tube over 3 feet long, sealed at one end, filled with mercury. Yes, liquid metal, because nothing screams brilliant idea like a toxic substance in a breakable tube, and inverted into a dish also filled with mercury. Once the tube was flipped, the mercury dropped slightly, creating a space at the top with nothing. That nothing was everything. That was the first man-made vacuum, and it made people very nervous. Why? Because the vacuum was a deeply controversial idea. For over 1,000 years, philosophers, particularly Aristotle, insisted that a vacuum was impossible. Nature abhors a vacuum, they said, as though the universe had a personal grudge against empty space. It wasn't just a scientific opinion, it was practically doctrine. So when Torricelli looked at his mercury tube and went, "Guys, there's literally nothing up there," many scientists were fascinated, and many theologians were deeply disturbed. Suddenly, scientific circles were flooded with discussions about the implications of a vacuum. If air could be removed, if nothingness could exist, then what else could science discover? Theologians wrung their hands, worrying it might unravel the sacred order of the cosmos. After all, if God filled the universe, where did this nothing come from? Was the top of Torricelli's barometer a godless zone? A tiny pocket of atheism? Worse, could it become trendy? Torricelli, ever the tactful scientist, simply referred to the empty space as a Torricellian vacuum. A smart branding move, because nothing freaks people out less than having their fear named after a friendly Italian. His invention, the barometer, was revolutionary, not because it could predict rain, it couldn't yet, but because it proved the atmosphere had weight. That alone was a massive shift. It meant pressure could be measured, quantified, even harnessed. It paved the way for all kinds of future experiments involving air pressure, steam engines, and weather forecasting. But more than that, it cracked open the door for the Enlightenment to stroll in, powdered wig and all, and start questioning everything from divine providence to whether clouds were actually just sky sheep. Torricelli didn't live long after his breakthrough. He died at 39, but his little mercury-filled science stunt sent shockwaves across Europe. Think of him as the guy who turned air from a background character into a headline act. He also unknowingly kick-started the long, messy, occasionally soggy journey of trying to forecast the weather. Today, we take vacuums for granted. They clean our floors, seal our snacks, and suck the life out of inflatable beds. But in the 1640s, they challenged the very nature of reality, and all because Torricelli wondered why water in a tube didn't keep climbing forever. So next time you see a weather forecast that's wrong for the 5th day in a row, remember, it all started with a mercury stick, a risky idea, and the willingness to tell nature, actually, we're going to make some empty space whether you like it or not. Let's set the scene. It's the late 1600s, and someone strolls into town holding a glass tube full of shiny silver liquid. It stands upright, reacting strangely to changes in the air. The people nearby aren't sure if it's a scientific instrument or a portable curse. Then someone whispers, "It moves by itself." The logical conclusion: witchcraft. Obviously, this shimmering mystery was mercury, also called quicksilver, because it slithered like a metal snake and made absolutely nobody feel comfortable. Scientists loved it for being heavy, stable, and delightfully reactive to atmospheric pressure, but to the average 17th century peasant, it might as well have been bottled black magic. The man who had the nerve to create a glass tube filled with it, Evangelista Torricelli, had died before the world could really appreciate how freaked out it would get. Torricelli had used mercury to construct the first functioning barometer, proving that air had weight and could push down on liquids. It was brilliant, it was groundbreaking, and it was horrifying. See, people were not ready for the sight of a fluid that wasn't water, wine, or something you could dip bread into. Mercury didn't act the way liquids were supposed to. It didn't soak into cloth. It didn't mix. It rolled. It gleamed. It looked like the devil's nail polish. And to top it off, this weird tube supposedly told the future, specifically whether or not it was going to rain. This was not a time known for its love of innovation. In fact, if you created something new and it actually worked, that was suspicious by default. A working barometer meant you were clearly consorting with unnatural forces. "How could a man know when the storm is coming?" asked the village priest. "Unless he put the storm there himself." Cue lightning flash and dramatic gasp. Barometers started gaining a reputation, and not the good kind. In some regions, especially across rural Europe, barometers were confiscated or banned outright. Their owners were accused of dabbling in sorcery or attempting to read the will of God, which was a job exclusively reserved for men in cassocks, yelling from wooden pulpits. Barometers, apparently, lacked proper theological training, and when a barometer predicted a storm, and then the storm actually happened, people didn't think, "Wow, what a clever tool." They thought, "Well, he definitely summoned that rain. Burn it now." Entire communities would gang up on these suspicious tubes, smash them to pieces and toss the remains into rivers as if mercury were some ghostly parasite that needed to be drowned. Some barometer owners were lucky enough to survive the mobs, but many learned quickly to keep their storm sticks locked in drawers and out of sight. And then there was the clergy. To many church leaders, the barometer was a theological nightmare wrapped in a glass cylinder. Predicting weather was treading dangerously close to predicting divine will, and that was simply unacceptable. Rain, wind, drought, these were heaven's tools, handed out to reward or punish depending on how much dancing and tithing you'd done lately. Using a scientific instrument to guess God's next move was about as subtle as poking a lion with a quill pen. Some particularly excitable priests called barometers tools of the devil, instruments of vanity, or simply ungodly tubes, because nothing quite ruffled a cassock like someone checking the air pressure instead of praying for clear skies. Of course, this didn't stop some brave tinkerers and wealthy eccentric types from keeping barometers around. A few nobles liked the drama of owning one. "Look, it drops when it's stormy. Isn't that sinister?" While others genuinely believed the device had magical properties. One English lord reportedly used his barometer to decide when to go hunting, when to hide in the cellar, and when to accuse his cook of witchcraft, though that may have just been dinner-related. Still, despite the backlash, the barometer survived. It dodged the stake, escaped the river, and slowly wormed its way into polite society. It helped that mercury was heavy, reliable, and hard to ignore. It didn't freeze in the winter, it didn't evaporate under normal conditions, and most importantly, it worked. Even if people didn't like it, they eventually had to admit that it was oddly correct. And so the mercury barometer became the weird uncle of the scientific world. A bit spooky, a bit misunderstood, but undeniably helpful. Sure, it made you nervous. And yes, you weren't quite sure whether it was powered by physics or eldritch horror. But when the pressure dropped, it meant you should probably bring in the laundry. And that ultimately was enough. In the 1600s, if you wanted to predict the weather, you needed three things: a long glass tube, an unhealthy amount of mercury, and blind optimism. Evangelista Torricelli's invention, the mercury barometer, was elegant, fragile, wildly impractical, and the height of scientific sophistication. If you were wealthy, curious, or just really tired of getting caught in the rain wearing wool, this was your new must-have contraption. Torricelli's design was beautifully simple in theory. Take a glass tube, seal one end, Fill it entirely with mercury. Don't spill any. It's toxic. And then invert it over a bowl also filled with mercury. Gravity does its thing. The mercury drops a bit in the tube, and voila, you've got a vacuum at the top. And the remaining mercury column rises and falls depending on atmospheric pressure. If it rose, it likely meant good weather. If it dropped, a storm was coming. If it exploded in your hands, you were probably doing it wrong. And while this was a groundbreaking way to read the sky, it wasn't exactly convenient. For starters, mercury is dense and heavy, and the column needed to be about 30 inches, 76 centimeters tall to function. That meant any respectable barometer took up a lot of vertical space. Mounting one indoors was a bit like inviting a very quiet and vaguely sinister roommate to live in the hallway. Still, people were intrigued, and scientists, as they do, got competitive. Variants of the mercury barometer began popping up across Europe like soggy mushrooms. Daniel Gabriel Fahrenheit of thermometer fame got in on the action. Robert Hooke, who had opinions about everything, also chimed in with design tweaks. The Royal Society couldn't get enough of these vacuum toys, and eventually, mercury barometers became the lab equipment equivalent of a status symbol, like a leather-bound telescope, but somehow messier. Then came the water barometer. For those who wanted their scientific instruments to double as a splash zone, the idea was similar to Torricelli's, but instead of mercury, you used water, significantly less toxic, but dramatically less dense. This meant your tube had to be about 10 meters tall to work properly. That's over 30 feet. If you think that's absurd, you're not wrong. One of the first working models had to be installed up the side of a tower just to read the pressure. In fairness, the display value was fantastic, but unless you lived in a lighthouse, it wasn't exactly home decor. And then came the aneroid barometer, the mercury-free, less murdery version that actually began to gain popularity in the 19th century. It used a small, flexible metal box called an aneroid cell. This cell expanded or contracted with changes in air pressure, and gears translated that movement into a needle reading on a dial. No mercury, no giant tubes, no accidental poisonings. It was compact, portable, and far easier to use, so naturally, people still preferred the mercury ones because they looked fancier. Science was great, but aesthetics still mattered. But if mercury-filled glass tubes weren't mystical enough, Victorian England gave us the storm glass, a contraption so bizarre it practically deserves its own séance. The storm glass looked like a sealed cylinder full of mysterious chemicals, often including camphor and alcohol, that would allegedly form crystals depending on upcoming weather. Clear liquid meant clear skies, cloudiness predicted rain, and flaky crystals supposedly warned of storms. It had the air of a magical snow globe that took itself very seriously. Admiral Fitzroy, yes, the same man who captained the Beagle while Charles Darwin went full naturalist, popularized the storm glass in the 1800s. He believed it could predict weather changes, and it quickly found its way onto British mantels, ship decks, and curiosity cabinets. The only catch? It wasn't very accurate at all. Crystals formed or didn't form depending on temperature, not pressure, and using it to plan a picnic was more wishful thinking than actual forecasting. Still, Victorians loved it, and if it didn't predict rain, at least it looked good doing it. By the 18th century, barometers of all types were finding homes in schools, private libraries, and the mansions of wealthy eccentrics. They weren't just instruments, they were conversation starters. Owning a barometer suggested you had taste, an appreciation for the scientific method, and possibly a cabinet of curiosities featuring taxidermied owls and preserved beetles. Families would check the barometer before going outside and then ignore it anyway because that's tradition. And while today we rely on satellite imaging and Doppler radar, early forecasting was far more intimate. It involved peering at a piece of trembling glass, trying to read the mood of the atmosphere like it was an emotional Victorian aunt. A drop in the mercury. Probably best to cancel your promenade. Crystals floating mysteriously in a storm glass. Take your umbrella and perhaps make peace with the gods. Barometers may not have been perfect, but they were certainly ambitious. in an age where science and superstition still lived side by side. Predicting the weather wasn't just about staying dry. It was about peering into the heavens and daring to understand their moods. And if that meant installing a 6-foot glass tube full of toxic metal in your drawing room, well, so be it. Imagine walking into a posh 18th century drawing room, the kind with brocade curtains, uncomfortable chairs, and enough candlelight to trigger a house fire. Among the portraits, porcelain dogs and globe that hadn't moved since the War of the Spanish Succession, there it stood, a tall, dignified wooden object that looked like it might summon demons or perhaps just tell you it was going to drizzle. This was the barometer, half science, half sorcery, and 100% fashionable. It was the must-have conversation piece for the upwardly mobile Georgian and Victorian elite. By the mid-1700s, barometers had transitioned from terrifying tubes of suspicious silver liquid into prized household showpieces. This wasn't because people suddenly understood how they worked. Far from it. No, it was because barometers had undergone a transformation from awkward scientific tool to high-end decorative art. Craftsmen began encasing these instruments in ornately carved mahogany, rosewood, or walnut, polishing every surface until it gleamed like the forehead of a man who'd just realized he left his wig on the carriage. The dials were often brass or ivory, with inscriptions so poetic they could have been lifted from a weather-themed opera. Forget bland phrases like rain likely. These barometers whispered of atmospheric whimsy, change, stormy, fair, set fair, and the particularly foreboding much rain. The vagueness was part of the charm. You could read the dial and decide whether to bring an umbrella or simply blame the decline in pressure on your melancholia. Barometers began appearing in parlors, libraries, studies, and drawing rooms, not so much to be consulted as to be admired. A gentleman might stand beside his barometer, swirling a glass of port, casually tapping the tube as if to imply he knew what he was doing. He didn't, but the barometer gave the impression that here stood a man of science, a man who understood the world, or at least owned enough walnut furniture to pretend. Ladies were equally intrigued, while etiquette forbade them from engaging in heated discussions about things like politics, banking, or whether or not their husband's powdered wig was a fire hazard. Weather was fair game. Observing the barometer's needle shift was an acceptable parlor pastime. One could exclaim, "Oh dear, it's falling fast," and follow with a dramatic sigh that hinted either at a coming storm or impending emotional collapse. In some homes, the barometer even became a kind of passive-aggressive household oracle. If the air pressure dropped, it was assumed that bad moods, spoiled milk, and general inconvenience would follow. Servants were occasionally blamed for the weather, as if overcooked mutton had somehow angered the gods and tilted the dial toward very damp. There were, of course, those who still viewed the barometer with suspicion. Anything that could supposedly predict the heavens might still smell faintly of heresy. Superstitious whispers persisted in some corners of Europe. Was the barometer simply a disguised relic of alchemy? Did it contain spirits besides Mercury trapped in its wooden frame? Was it safe to keep near the piano? To answer those fears, wealthy barometer owners simply doubled down on ornamentation. If it looked more like a grandfather clock and less like a scientific instrument, people would stop worrying it might steal their soul. So barometers grew taller, more embellished, and increasingly absurd. Some stood over 6 feet, dwarfing the modest scholars who owned them. Others featured multiple dials for pressure, temperature, humidity, and your chances of having a pleasant picnic. Slim as usual. Soon, to own a barometer was to announce one's sophistication. It didn't matter if it was accurate, it was elegant. It didn't matter if it said storm while birds sang outside and the gardener got sunburnt. It looked smashing next to the cabinet of curiosity and that stuffed crocodile from Uncle Edmund's unfortunate Nile expedition. And let's be honest, many of these barometers were glorified guess machines. Temperature shifts, elevation quirks, and user error, e.g., tapping it too hard or confusing fair for fear, made many predictions more theatrical than trustworthy, but it didn't matter. In an era obsessed with appearance and propriety, Having a barometer in your home meant you were someone who took nature seriously, or at least had the disposable income to pretend. Ultimately, the barometer in the drawing room wasn't about the weather, it was about image, taste, and social altitude, much like the powdered wig, the monocle, and the tendency to name one's dog Horace. It said something about who you were. Specifically, I may not know if it's going to rain, but I look absolutely brilliant while guessing. The open sea, endless waves, salty wind, and the lingering suspicion that your ship might spontaneously explode into a soggy pile of timber at any moment. Before modern meteorology and GPS, sailors relied on a mix of instinct, superstition, and sheer blind luck to survive the mercurial wrath of Poseidon. Then came the barometer, a delicate tube of mercury, promising to warn of impending doom. Naturally, this was greeted with skepticism, mild terror, and the occasional mutiny. It didn't take long for sea captains to realize that the barometer could be more than just a gentleman's parlor toy. When you're stuck on a wooden vessel in the middle of a tempest-prone ocean, any hint of an upcoming storm is worth clinging to, even if it involves squinting at a metal needle and pretending you know what falling pressure actually means. By the mid-18th century, barometers had sailed their way into ship cabins. Early maritime models were often compact and sturdy, built to survive rolling waves and clumsy cabin boys. Of course, bringing a glass tube filled with toxic mercury onto a heaving deck wasn't without its challenges. One hard jolt, and the storm you were preparing for was now a puddle of poison sloshing across the floorboards. Still, brave captains persevered. They mounted barometers in protective cases, read them religiously, and scribbled cryptic entries in their logbooks. Pressure fell rapidly. Expect squall. Jenkins still insolent. These records became the seafaring equivalent of Twitter. Short, emotional, and often filled with unverified information. The general rule of thumb at sea became, if the barometer drops, so does your confidence in making it home. Rapidly falling pressure meant an approaching low-pressure system which, in sailor terms, translated to brace for impact. A sudden shift could prompt orders to reef the sails, batten the hatches, or just start praying really hard. Some captains treated their barometer like a sacred relic, checking it more often than their own reflection. Others, well, let's just say they preferred their omens in the form of albatross sightings and old crewmen's aching knees. This collision of science and superstition led to some truly inspired nautical drama. Barometers were blamed for bad luck, praised for good fortune, and occasionally thrown overboard when things went south anyway. Sailors were not known for subtlety. One story tells of a mutinous crew accusing their captain's barometer of summoning the storm and demanding it be smashed to protect the ship from demonic influence. The barometer lost. Despite the occasional overreaction, barometers gradually earned their place among trusted maritime tools. Naval officers were taught how to read them properly, and the practice of keeping meteorological logs became standard. Over time, sailors developed a basic understanding of atmospheric pressure and its implications, though not necessarily enough to stop writing things like barometer low, possibly cursed. Barometers also played a crucial role in navigation and planning. A ship might alter course to avoid a brewing cyclone or slow down to let a storm pass ahead. With no satellite images or weather apps to consult, this little mercury tube could mean the difference between arriving safely or starring in a future shipwreck ballad. Meteorological bravery, it seems, sometimes came in the form of quietly adjusting your heading because your glass stick told you so. Still, some captains used the barometer more for dramatic effect than practicality. One could imagine a particularly theatrical officer gathering his crew with a grim face, pointing to the barometer, and gravely intoning, "The pressure falls, we sail into the jaws of Neptune," followed immediately by Jenkins rolling his eyes and muttering something about another sleepless night. Of course, all the barometric caution in the world couldn't prevent the occasional catastrophe. Weather is a fickle beast, and 18th century instruments weren't exactly precision calibrated. A sudden squall could still strike without warning, and barometers occasionally gave false hope or false despair. Still, they added a veneer of control in a chaotic world. when the sky darkened and waves rose, a captain could at least glance at his barometer and mutter, "I knew this would happen," before disappearing below deck to vomit. Eventually, marine barometers became more reliable and standardized. Aneroid barometers without mercury made their way onto ships, reducing the risk of toxic spills during storms. Today, we have satellites and storm tracking and radar, but in the golden age of sails and superstition, barometers were a sailor's fragile friend, part oracle, part science, and always one cracked tube away from panic. And while the modern mariner might scoff at the idea of making life or death decisions based on a tiny brass dial, back then, it was the best shot you had. Well, that and Jenkins' notoriously weather-sensitive gout. By the time the 19th century rolled in wearing a starched collar and a slightly smug expression, the weather had finally become more than just a farmer's problem or a sailor's nemesis. It had graduated to being everyone's business. Enter the age of meteorology. Well, proto-meteorology. The science was still in its awkward teenage years, plenty of enthusiasm, questionable decisions, and more guesses than guarantees. One man who decided the clouds needed taming was Robert Fitzroy. And yes, that is the same Robert Fitzroy who once captained the HMS Beagle, the ship that carried a certain Charles Darwin around the globe while he collected enough notes and bird skulls to make Victorian science weep with joy and outrage. But while Darwin went on to scandalize polite society with talk of monkeys and missing links, Fitzroy had a different mission: keep people from dying in storms, ideally with the help of a barometer and some neatly written charts. Fitzroy was a naval officer, hydrographer, and serious overachiever who didn't just dabble in weather. He threw himself into it with the kind of fervor usually reserved for religious conversions or attempting to play Beethoven's entire symphony cycle on a kazoo. After witnessing the sheer destructiveness of storms while at sea, and seeing countless lives lost on the British coastline, he decided enough was enough. In the early 1850s, while heading the new meteorological department of the Board of Trade, which sounds very dull but was secretly the foundation of modern forecasting, Fitzroy launched a project that would change the way people looked at clouds forever, or at least squinted at them with a bit more skepticism. Fitzroy's idea was simple: warn people. Groundbreaking, right? He proposed setting up barometers in key coastal locations and developing a system that would interpret the readings to give advance warning of dangerous weather. These weren't just vague murmurs about dreary skies, but full-blown storm approaching, turn back or meet your maker kind of alerts. He used telegraph lines, Victorian Twitter basically, to send messages between observation stations, creating one of the earliest forms of a national weather warning system. It was the meteorological version of shouting "run" through a really long tin can phone. But because this was the 19th century, and everyone was either confused or very good at ignoring good advice, Fitzroy's forecasts were met with mixed reactions. Some fishermen called him a prophet. Others called him a menace for disrupting their schedules. Newspapers, eager to capitalize on public interest and possibly create new crossword sections, started publishing daily weather forecasts, which Fitzroy himself wrote with the seriousness of someone attempting to predict divine moods. These early forecasts were, shall we say, optimistically scientific. They had just enough accuracy to get people excited, and just enough mistakes to get Fitzroy's name cursed by wet pedestrians from Cornwall to Aberdeen. The tools Fitzroy used were still basic. There were barometers for pressure, wind vanes, and the ever-reliable eyeballing the horizon technique. The forecasts, then, were a mix of data, intuition, and desperate hope. But despite their imperfections, the very existence of public weather predictions was revolutionary. For the first time, it wasn't just nature whisperers and arthritic dogs that claimed storm-sensing abilities. There were charts, numbers, and official announcements. Fitzroy's passion bordered on obsession. He even created barometer instruction booklets for the public, trying to teach people how to read pressure changes and not immediately panic when the mercury dipped. In many port towns, small kiosks displayed barometer readings with helpful signs: fair, change, storm likely, and presumably abandon hope if things got too bleak. But not everyone loved the idea of predicting the weather, especially when it came with the suggestion that maybe, just maybe, it wasn't all up to divine will. Church authorities grumbled, suspicious minds feared manipulation, and critics accused Fitzroy of playing God with a tube full of mercury. Still, he persisted, even as the accuracy of his forecasts was hotly debated over brandy and cigars. Sadly, the pressure, emotional, not barometric, took its toll. Fitzroy, burdened by personal demons, public criticism, and the kind of schedule that would make modern meteorologists faint, tragically died by suicide in 1865. His contributions, however, didn't fade with him, so while the world still didn't know whether to pack an umbrella or wear sandals, they now had some idea, and that alone was enough to make barometers the second most read item in a Victorian newspaper, after scandals involving dukes and horses. Victorian Britain, where modesty reigned, ankles were scandalous, and small talk was a national sport. And what was the safest, driest, most thoroughly acceptable topic in any drawing room, tea room, or train compartment? The weather. If you couldn't speak of your feelings, God forbid, or politics, too volatile, or the economy, too real, you could always safely speculate about the barometric pressure. The Victorians had an unrelenting passion for measurement, and nothing escaped their need to catalogue temperature, humidity, rainfall, wind direction. If it changed even slightly over the course of a day, someone somewhere wrote it down in an embossed leather diary. And thus began the golden age of gentlemen meteorologists, amateurs in top hats, armed with quills and thermometers, ready to bravely misinterpret the skies for queen and country. Weather diaries became all the rage, not because they were particularly useful, but because they made the average man feel like he had dominion over the elements. One could record Monday's drizzle, Tuesday's fog, and Wednesday's faint sunbeam with a satisfying level of smug precision. These entries often sat alongside notes about garden blooms, headaches, or the untrustworthy look of a neighbor's chimney smoke. The weather diary was the Instagram of its day. If Instagram had been made of ink, parchment, and crushing boredom, scientific societies too got in on the act. Weather clubs sprang up across Britain, filled with well-meaning enthusiasts who gathered for the noble cause of collective meteorological guesswork. They held meetings, compared readings, and occasionally published findings. While a handful genuinely contributed to climate science, most functioned as polite excuses to escape the house and drink tea while staring solemnly at clouds. The competition was fierce. Gentlemen vied for whose barometer was tallest, whose readings were most consistent, and whose interpretations sounded the most intelligent while being absolutely unverifiable. This was Victorian science at its most charming and least efficient. Of course, weather watching wasn't always about science. Sometimes it was just a good excuse for some top-tier gossip. The lady of the house might casually glance at the ornate barometer in the hallway and announce, "Rain is imminent." How droll. This, naturally, was a subtle cue to switch the conversation to Mrs. Penelope from across the street, whose roses were tragically overwatered and whose marriage was probably just as soggy. Barometers during this period became more than scientific instruments. They were decorative statements. These weren't your bare-bones utilitarian tubes of mercury anymore. No. Victorian barometers came housed in gorgeously carved mahogany or walnut frames, with curlicues, scrollwork, and poetic inscriptions like fair, change, or stormy, with a chance of existential dread. Some were so extravagantly made, they'd have looked more at home in a cathedral than a cottage hallway. But as style increased, accuracy quietly slipped out the back door. Many barometers were no longer calibrated, maintained, or even correctly read. A beautifully engraved dial pointing at very dry might simply have been stuck, but who cared? It looked good. The Victorian mantra was essentially, if you can't control the heavens, at least make them match the wallpaper. This cultural obsession with weather also gave rise to perhaps the most passive-aggressive form of British communication, polite complaint. "Lovely drizzle today," one might mutter, staring gloomily out the window. "Indeed," the other would reply, "positively refreshing for the rhododendrons." This was code for I am soaked to the bone, my shoes are ruined, and life is a grey wet sponge, but I'm too emotionally constipated to say so directly. The weather was not just conversation, it was performance. Victorians didn't just check the barometer, they performed a ritual. A gentleman might tap the glass, squint thoughtfully, nod once and announce, "Change coming." Whether or not it did was beside the point. He had fulfilled his social duty. By the late 19th century, the sheer amount of weather paraphernalia in the average upper-class home had become absurd. Thermometers hung beside barometers, hygrometers nestled beside storm glasses, and all of them were watched by people who still brought umbrellas just in case. For all their instruments and diaries, the average Victorian had a weather accuracy rate only marginally better than your dog hiding under the table. But in the end, none of that mattered. The barometer, like so many other things in Victorian Britain, was about appearances, aspiration, and the comforting illusion of control. It allowed people to believe they were taming the untamable, understanding the unknowable, and dressing it up in walnut and Latin, once the gleaming pride of parlour walls and nautical cabins. The barometer has quietly slid from centre stage to backstage, where it now lives in your smartphone, calculating whether your afternoon jog will end in sun or sogginess. But don't be fooled by its digital disguise. The humble barometer is still very much with us, humming along inside modern tech, doing the job it's always done, measuring pressure and ruining picnics. The decline of the traditional barometer began in the 20th century, when people started realizing they didn't need a brass-adorned wooden shrine in their hallway to guess the weather. Mercury, once the darling of 17th century weather prophets, was now a hazardous substance frowned upon by health officials and common sense. Eventually, barometers went from essential household forecasting tool to vaguely threatening glass tube of poison your aunt still keeps next to the grandfather clock. But while they were disappearing from living rooms, barometers were sneaking into places no one had predicted. Airplanes, for one. The barometer evolved into the altimeter, an essential cockpit instrument that lets pilots know how high they're flying, or more importantly, how close they are to not flying anymore. Skydivers trust them, so do mountaineers, hikers and weather balloon enthusiasts who enjoy floating into the stratosphere for fun and frostbite. Then came the digital age, when meteorologists swapped brass for binary and filled supercomputers with weather models that could predict a hurricane's path before it even had a name. Satellite data, Doppler radar, and global climate models took over forecasting, but none of them forgot the barometer's original purpose: reading pressure to anticipate change. Whether it's a hurricane swirling over the Atlantic or a drizzle threatening your garden party, the basic principle is the same: lower pressure equals higher drama. And while the Mercury barometer has become a museum piece, its spirit has never retired. In fact, it's probably strapped to your wrist right now. Fitness trackers, smartwatches, and smartphones use built-in barometric sensors to detect altitude changes. Climb a flight of stairs, your watch knows. Go hiking, your phone can track elevation. Walk into an emotionally charged family dinner? Sadly, still no reading for that yet. There's also the modern nostalgia factor. The barometer has made a stylish little comeback as a vintage curiosity. Antique shops sell them to people who want to feel vaguely nautical, vaguely intellectual, and definitely a little steampunk. You'll find them in leather-bound libraries, hipster cafes, and living rooms owned by people who say things like, "I find analog so grounding." Never mind that the thing hasn't been accurate since Queen Victoria was still dodging rain with a parasol. What matters is the vibe, and despite its quirky journey, the barometer's legacy is no joke. It helped humanity understand atmospheric pressure, revolutionize meteorology, and eventually map the entire planet's climate. Without it, we'd be back in the days of watching cows lie down and declaring, "Rain's coming." It was the gateway drug to modern climate science, the original hardware of weather prediction, now upgraded to software that tracks cyclones from space. The irony, despite all our tech, we're still just as confused by the weather. The barometer has evolved into something that lives inside satellites, smartphones, and smart homes, but at its core, it still whispers the same old question: how much pressure is in the air, and should you bring a coat. So next time your app buzzes with a chance of showers, spare a thought for the tube of shimmering liquid mercury that started it all. It stood tall, usually 3 feet tall, endured superstition, scandal, and scientific revolutions, and ultimately paved the way for a world where even your watch can shame you into cancelling your jog.